Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through the primordial mists of time, where gods walked among mortals and the very fabric of reality was woven from divine will and ancient magic. Tonight, we delve into Hyrule's oldest myths, the stories whispered by starlight and carved in stone by civilizations whose names have been forgotten by all but the deepest memories of the earth itself. These are tales of creation and destruction, of goddesses and demons, of the eternal dance between light and shadow that began before the first sunrise touched Hyrule's sacred soil. Close your eyes, let time dissolve around you, and drift back to the very beginning of all things. In the time before time, when existence itself was nothing more than a whispered possibility in the vast emptiness that preceded all creation, there was only the void. This was not merely the absence of light or the silence between sounds, but something far more profound and absolute, the complete negation of being itself, a realm where even the concept of nothingness held no meaning, because there was no consciousness to perceive or define it. The void stretched through dimensions that had no names, across distances that could not be measured, for an eternity that contained no moments to count. It was a perfection of emptiness, so complete that it seemed as though nothing could ever disturb its infinite tranquility. Yet within this absolute nothingness, something stirred, not a presence, for presence requires form, but rather a potential, a possibility that had always existed, but had never before chosen to express itself. From somewhere beyond the boundaries of non-existence came the first of the golden goddesses, Din, the embodiment of power itself made manifest. Her arrival in the void was not a gentle emergence, but a cataclysmic explosion of divine will that shattered the very concept of emptiness and replaced it with the fundamental forces of creation. Where her presence touched the nothingness, matter burst into being with the fury of 1 trillion stars being born simultaneously, each particle charged with the raw energy of divine purpose. Din's flame was not the mere combustion that mortals would later know, but something infinitely more primal and essential, the very principle of change and transformation given physical form. Her fire consumed nothing because there was nothing yet to consume, but instead it created the basic building blocks of reality from the pure potential that had always existed but had never been given expression. Stone and metal, earth and crystal, all the solid foundations upon which future worlds would stand, flowed from her divine essence like molten rivers of possibility. The goddess danced through the emerging cosmos with movements that defied description, each gesture calling forth new forms of matter and energy. Where she stepped, mountains rose from the void like sleeping giants awakening to greet the dawn. Where her hands swept through the emptiness, vast continents took shape, their surfaces scarred and beautiful with valleys and peaks that spoke of incredible forces at work in the very heart of creation. Yet Din's creation, for all its magnificent power and overwhelming scale, remained chaotic and unformed. The matter she had called forth swirled in endless, purposeless motion, colliding and combining and separating again without pattern or meaning. It was raw potential without direction, energy without purpose, a cosmos that existed but did not yet truly live. The goddess of power had given birth to the physical realm, but birth alone was not enough to create a world where life could flourish. Into this beautiful chaos came the second of the golden goddesses, Nehru, whose very being embodied wisdom in its purest and most perfect form. Where Din had been fire and fury, creation through explosive force, Nehru was precision and understanding, the divine mind that could perceive the patterns hidden within apparent randomness and impose order upon the magnificent disorder her sister had created. Nehru's touch upon the churning matter was gentle but irresistible, like the tide that shapes the shoreline grain by grain across countless ages. Where Din's power had created through destruction and recreation, Nehru's wisdom worked through patient arrangement and careful design. She saw the potential for beauty and function hidden within the chaos and began the delicate work of bringing that potential to fruition. Under her guiding influence, the endless collisions of matter began to follow predictable patterns. The random motion of particles aligned itself into the fundamental laws that would govern all physical existence. Gravity learned to pull objects toward each other with mathematical precision. Time began its steady march forward, creating the framework within which change could occur in ordered sequence, rather than chaotic simultaneity. The goddess shaped the raw stuff of creation with the skill of an artist working with the finest materials. But her artistry operated on a scale that dwarfed any mortal imagination. She carved the courses that rivers would follow for millions of years, established the patterns of weather that would bring life-giving rain to future forests, and set the great celestial bodies in their eternal dance through the heavens. Every natural law, from the way light bends when it passes through water to the spiral patterns that would appear in seashells and galaxies alike, flowed from her infinite understanding of how beauty and function could be perfectly united. Yet even with matter organized and natural laws established, the cosmos remained fundamentally lifeless. It was a magnificent clockwork, perfect in its precision and beautiful in its mathematical harmony, but it was still only a clockwork complex beyond comprehension, but lacking the spark that would transform mechanical perfection into something truly alive. The realm that Din and Nehru had created together was ready for life, but it could not create life from within itself. This was the moment when the third of the golden goddesses made her presence known in the ordered cosmos. Farore, the embodiment of courage, brought with her something that neither raw power nor perfect wisdom could provide: the divine breath that would transform sterile perfection into a living world, capable of growth, change, and infinite possibility. Where her sisters had worked with matter and natural law, Farore worked with something far more mysterious and precious: the essence of life itself. Her gift to creation was not another set of physical principles or natural forces, but rather the spark of awareness that would allow the cosmos to know itself, to experience its own existence, and to choose its own path through the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Under Farore's loving guidance, the first simple forms of life stirred in the shallow seas and sheltered valleys that Nehru's wisdom had prepared for them. These earliest creatures were humble beyond description, barely more than organized collections of living matter, but they carried within them something that had never before existed in all the vast expanse of creation: the capacity for growth, for adaptation, for choice, and for the kind of love that would eventually create families and communities and entire civilizations. The goddess of courage did not limit herself to the creation of life in its most basic forms, but instead planted within each living thing the seeds of infinite potential. The smallest creatures carried within their essence the possibility of evolving into forms of incredible complexity and beauty. The simplest plants held the potential to become mighty forests that would shelter countless generations of creatures yet to be born. Most remarkable of all, Farore imbued certain of her creations with something that approached her own divine nature: the capacity for courage itself, the ability to face the unknown with hope rather than fear, to choose growth over safety, and to act with love even when such action required personal sacrifice. These would be the ancestors of the races that would one day build cities and compose songs, explore distant lands, and create works of art that would move the hearts of beings they would never meet. The three goddesses worked in perfect harmony, their different aspects of divinity complementing and strengthening each other in ways that created results far greater than any of them could have achieved alone. Din's power provided the energy that drove all change and growth. Nehru's wisdom ensured that such changes followed patterns that created beauty and meaning rather than mere chaos. Farore's courage gave every living thing the strength to embrace those changes and grow toward ever greater complexity and wonder. Together, they had created not merely a world, but an entire cosmos capable of supporting life in forms so diverse and magnificent that even their divine vision could not predict all the wonders that would eventually emerge. They had established the foundation for everything that would ever exist, from the smallest flower blooming in a hidden valley to the great kingdoms that would rise and fall across the turning of ages. Yet as the goddesses looked upon the perfect world they had created together, they recognized that their direct involvement in its affairs could not continue indefinitely. A cosmos shaped entirely by divine will, no matter how loving that will might be, could never truly grow beyond the limitations of its creator's imagination. True beauty, true meaning, true love could only emerge from beings who were free to choose their own paths, even if those choices sometimes led to pain and loss, as well as joy and discovery. The decision to withdraw from direct governance of their creation was perhaps the greatest act of love the golden goddesses ever performed. They understood that the world they had made with such care could only reach its full potential if its inhabitants were allowed to face their own challenges, make their own mistakes, and discover their own solutions to the problems that would inevitably arise. But the goddesses did not abandon their creation entirely. Instead, they chose to leave behind a gift that would allow mortals to access divine power when their need was greatest and their hearts were pure enough to use such power wisely. From the very essence of their own divine nature, they created 3 golden triangles that contained concentrated portions of their fundamental aspects: power, wisdom, and courage. These 3 pieces, when joined together, would form the sacred relic known throughout all future ages as the Triforce, the ultimate expression of divine will, made accessible to mortal hands. Yet the goddesses, in their infinite wisdom, established conditions that would prevent the Triforce from being misused by those whose hearts were corrupted by selfish ambition or consumed by hatred. Only one whose heart was perfectly balanced, who embodied all 3 aspects of divinity in equal measure, could claim the complete Triforce and wield its full power without corruption. Such perfect balance was incredibly rare among mortals, for most people naturally leaned toward one aspect or another. Some were strong but lacked wisdom, others were wise but lacked courage, still others were brave but lacked the strength to see their courage through to its intended conclusion. When someone with an unbalanced heart touched the Triforce, the sacred relic would split apart, granting that person only the portion that most closely matched their nature, while the other 2 pieces would seek out individuals who embodied the remaining aspects. This divine safeguard ensured that no single person could claim absolute power unless they had first achieved the kind of spiritual perfection that would make them worthy of such responsibility. The 3 pieces of the Triforce were hidden away in a realm that existed parallel to the physical world, a sacred space where divine power could reside without overwhelming the natural order that the goddesses had so carefully established. This realm would come to be known as the Sacred Realm, and it would serve as both sanctuary and testing ground for those rare individuals who proved worthy of approaching ultimate power. The goddesses' final act before their departure was to establish certain sacred sites throughout the physical world, where their divine essence still touched the mortal realm most strongly. These places would serve as focal points for prayer and meditation, locations where mortals could feel the presence of the divine and seek guidance in times of great need. The most important of these sites would eventually become the Temple of Time, the spiritual heart of the kingdom that would one day rise to unite all the diverse peoples of the world under a single banner of hope and peace. With their work complete and their gifts bestowed upon the world they loved, the three golden goddesses began their withdrawal from direct involvement in mortal affairs. Their departure was not an abandonment, but a graduation, the loving act of parents who had raised their children to adulthood and now trusted them to make their own way in the world. Yet even as they retreated to realms beyond mortal understanding, the goddesses did not cease their vigilance entirely. They established a hierarchy of lesser divine beings who would serve as their representatives in the physical world, watching over creation and intervening only when absolutely necessary to prevent catastrophes that would end all life or corrupt the natural order beyond repair. Chief among these divine guardians would be Hyrule, a goddess whose love for mortals was so profound that she would eventually choose to abandon her own immortality in order to protect the people she had come to regard as her children. But that is a tale for another chapter of this ancient history, a story of sacrifice and love that would echo through all the ages to come. The golden goddesses had completed their great work, transforming absolute void into a living cosmos filled with infinite possibility. They had created the stage upon which countless dramas of heroism and love, tragedy and triumph would play out across the millennia. Most importantly, they had given every living being the freedom to choose its own destiny, to write its own story in the great book of existence. As their presence faded from direct perception, the world they had created continued to evolve and grow, developing complexity and beauty beyond even their divine imagination. The seeds they had planted would bloom into civilizations of wonder, into individuals whose courage would inspire songs for 10,000 years, into moments of such perfect love and selfless sacrifice that they would serve as beacons of hope in even the darkest times. The age of direct divine creation had ended, but the age of mortal potential was just beginning. In the gentle twilight of the goddess's departure, the first dawn of mortal history began to break across the horizon, carrying with it promises of adventure and discovery that would fulfill the deepest dreams of the divine beings who had made it all possible. The cosmos slept peacefully in the afterglow of creation, ready to awaken to whatever wonders the future might hold. In the ages that followed the golden goddesses' withdrawal from direct involvement in the affairs of creation, the world they had made began to develop its own rhythms and patterns of growth. Life flourished in countless forms across the continents and islands that had been shaped by divine hands, but among all the diverse creatures that walked, flew, and swam through the newly ordered cosmos, one species began to show particular promise for achieving the kind of spiritual development that might eventually bridge the gap between mortal and divine understanding. These were the early humans, beings whose capacity for both great love and terrible destruction exceeded even that of creatures, many times their physical size or apparent power. Unlike the other races that had emerged from Pharaoh's gift of life, humans possessed an almost godlike potential for growth and change, their brief lifespans paradoxically giving them an intensity of experience that longer-lived beings often struggled to match. Yet this same potential that made humans so remarkable also made them vulnerable to influences both light and dark. Their hearts could be shaped toward wisdom and compassion just as easily as they could be twisted toward cruelty and selfishness. Without proper guidance, the very qualities that made them capable of transcendent goodness could also lead them toward forms of evil that would shame the darkest nightmares of less adaptable creatures. It was this recognition of humanity's dual nature, this understanding of both their incredible potential and their desperate need for guidance, that moved one of the lesser goddesses to make a choice that would echo through all the ages of the world. Hylia, whose divine nature was so closely aligned with love and protection that she could barely comprehend the concept of abandoning those who needed her care, looked upon the struggling human tribes and felt her immortal heart break with compassion. Where the golden goddesses had loved their creation from the lofty heights of perfect divinity, Hylia's love was more intimate and immediate. She walked among the humans in forms they could perceive and understand, sharing their joys and sorrows with an empathy that transcended the usual boundaries between divine and mortal experience. She celebrated with them when children were born, mourned with them when elders passed into whatever realm awaited beyond death, and felt their pain as if it were her own when disease or disaster struck their communities. Under Hylia's gentle guidance, the scattered human tribes began to develop the foundations of what would eventually become a great civilization. She taught them to work together despite their differences, to share resources during times of scarcity, and to resolve conflicts through wisdom and compromise rather than violence and domination. Most importantly, she helped them understand that their greatest strength lay not in individual achievement, but in their capacity to care for one another with a selfless love that reflected the divine nature from which all life had originally sprung. The settlements that grew under Hylia's protection were unlike anything the world had seen before. They were not merely collections of dwellings grouped together for mutual defense, but genuine communities where every individual was valued for their unique contributions and no one was allowed to suffer alone. The sick were cared for by healers who had been taught that the preservation of life was sacred duty. The elderly were honored for their wisdom and experience, rather than cast aside as burdens. Children were raised not just by their parents, but by entire communities who understood that each young life represented the future hope of their people. As these communities grew and prospered, their inhabitants began to develop physical characteristics that set them apart from other human populations. Their ears grew longer and more pointed, as if reaching toward the divine realm from which their guidance came. This change was not merely cosmetic, but represented a deeper transformation of their spiritual nature, a gradual adaptation that allowed them to perceive frequencies of divine communication that remained inaudible to ordinary human senses. These blessed humans would eventually come to be known as the Hylians, and their pointed ears would serve throughout all future ages as a mark of their special relationship with the divine powers that watched over the world. They were not superior to other humans in any fundamental sense, but they had been shaped by their close contact with Hylia into beings who could serve as bridges between the mortal and divine realms. The golden age that flowered under Hylia's direct protection was a time of such peace and prosperity that later generations would struggle to believe the tales that were passed down about it. Wars were virtually unknown, not because humans had lost their capacity for conflict, but because the wisdom Hylia shared with them had taught them to resolve their differences before violence became necessary. Famine was a rarity, not because the climate was always perfect, but because communities had learned to share their resources across vast distances when local harvests failed. Art and music flourished as never before, expressing forms of beauty that seemed to capture something of the divine harmony that governed the natural world. Skilled craftsmen created objects of such perfect proportion and elegant design that they appeared almost to glow with inner light. Musicians composed melodies that could heal emotional wounds and inspire listeners to acts of selfless heroism. Poets found words that could express truths too profound for ordinary language, touching hearts in ways that transformed understanding and inspired moral growth. Yet even as Hylia reveled in the happiness and spiritual development of the people she had come to love as her own children, she remained aware of older and darker forces that stirred in the hidden places of the world. The creation of life and consciousness had not been an unmixed blessing, for along with the capacity for love and growth had come the potential for hatred and destruction. Where light grew bright, shadows naturally deepened, and in those shadows, things that should never have been given form were slowly gathering strength. From deep within the earth, where the raw chaos that had preceded ordered creation still pulsed with unformed potential, something ancient and malevolent had been watching the development of surface civilization with growing anger and resentment. This was not merely another form of life that had emerged from Farore's gift of living consciousness, but rather something far older and more fundamentally hostile to the very concept of ordered existence. Demise, as this entity would come to be known in the legends passed down by survivors of the catastrophe it would unleash, embodied the principle of entropy given malicious consciousness, where the golden goddesses had created in order to express love through beauty and complexity. Demise existed to return all ordered systems to the primordial chaos from which they had emerged. Its hatred was not personal but cosmic, directed not at individuals but at the very concept of existence itself. For countless ages, this demon king had been content to remain in the deepest places of the earth, feeding on the chaotic energies that still flowed in the world's molten core, and gradually gathering strength for the day when it would be powerful enough to challenge the ordered creation of the goddesses. The surface world's growing prosperity and spiritual development only increased its rage, for every act of love and creation was a personal affront to its fundamental nature. The first signs of Demise's stirring were so subtle that even Hylia's divine perception initially dismissed them as minor disturbances in the natural order. Earthquakes became slightly more frequent in certain regions, though not enough to cause serious concern. Strange lights were occasionally seen flickering in deep caves and abandoned mine shafts, but these were easily attributed to natural phosphorescence or the reflection of surface light through unusual crystal formations. More troubling were the reports that began to filter in from remote settlements of creatures that did not match any known form of wildlife. These beings were described as twisted amalgamations of familiar animal forms, as if something had taken the natural templates of creation and deliberately corrupted them into shapes designed to inspire fear and revulsion. They appeared primarily at night, attacking isolated travelers or small groups of settlers, before vanishing back into whatever dark refuges had spawned them. As these incidents became more frequent, and the creatures more bold in their attacks, Hylia began to recognize the signature of a malevolent intelligence that was actively working to corrupt and destroy the peaceful world she had helped to nurture. The monsters were not random mutations or natural predators, but rather the advanced scouts of something far more dangerous, an organized force that was testing the defenses of surface civilization in preparation for a much larger assault. The goddesses' divine senses, attuned as they were to the spiritual health of the world, began to detect disturbances in the fundamental fabric of reality itself. The careful balance that the golden goddesses had established between order and chaos was being deliberately disrupted by something that possessed both the power and the malicious intent necessary to threaten the very foundations of existence. Deep beneath the surface, in caverns that had never known sunlight, Demise was marshalling an army unlike anything the world had ever seen. The chaotic energies that it commanded could twist living matter into new forms that served its destructive purposes. creating beings that existed solely to spread fear and death among the peaceful populations above. These were not creatures in any meaningful sense, but rather weapons given rudimentary consciousness and an insatiable hunger for destruction. The Demon King's strategy was as brilliant as it was terrifying. Rather than emerging immediately to face the goddess in direct combat, it chose to wage a war of attrition that would gradually weaken both the moral and the material foundations of surface civilization. Its monsters would attack trade routes, isolating communities from one another and making cooperation difficult. They would target centers of learning and worship, destroying the accumulated wisdom and spiritual strength that held the peaceful world together. Most insidiously, the constant threat of random attack would gradually erode the trust and mutual support that had been the greatest achievement of Hylia's guidance. Communities that had once welcomed strangers with open arms would become suspicious and defensive. Neighbors who had shared everything would begin to hoard resources against an uncertain future. The bonds of love and cooperation that had made civilization possible would slowly fray under the pressure of perpetual danger. As the scope of the threat became clear, Hylia faced the most difficult decision of her divine existence. She could attempt to face Demise directly in her current form, trusting in her divine nature to overcome even such a fundamental force of destruction. But she understood with growing clarity that this ancient evil had been preparing for exactly such a confrontation for millennia, gathering power and knowledge specifically designed to counter divine intervention. More troubling still was her recognition that even if she could defeat Demise in single combat, such a victory would likely require her to unleash divine power on a scale that would devastate the very world she was trying to protect. The Golden Goddesses had withdrawn from direct intervention precisely because divine power, no matter how lovingly applied, tended to overwhelm the delicate balance that allowed mortal life to flourish. There was another path, however, one that would require a sacrifice so profound that even contemplating it filled Hylia's immortal heart with grief. If she could not defeat Demise as a goddess without destroying the world in the process, perhaps she could find victory by becoming something else entirely. The ancient prophecies spoke of a power that existed beyond even divine authority, a force that could emerge only from the perfect union of mortal courage and immortal wisdom. The more Hylia considered this possibility, the more inevitable it seemed. The battle against ultimate evil could not be won by divine power alone, no matter how pure or well-intentioned. It would require the kind of sacrifice that only a mortal heart could make, combined with wisdom and strength that only divine nature could provide. Such a combination was theoretically possible, but it would require her to abandon everything that had defined her existence since the beginning of time. As Demise's armies grew bolder and their attacks more devastating, Hylia began to prepare for a transformation that would echo through every age of the world's history. She gathered the most trusted leaders of the human communities and shared with them knowledge that had previously been reserved for divine beings alone. She taught them to recognize the signs of approaching evil, to organize their defenses in ways that would maximize their chances of survival, and most importantly, to maintain their faith in the ultimate triumph of light even during the darkest hours that lay ahead. The goddess also began to identify individuals whose spiritual development and natural courage marked them as potential champions in the cosmic struggle that was about to engulf the world. These would be the heroes and sages, the knights and protectors, who would carry on the fight against darkness even when divine guidance was no longer directly available to them. Most crucial of all was a young man whose heart burned with such pure courage that Hylia recognized in him the makings of the greatest hero the world had ever known. Link, though he did not yet understand the destiny that awaited him, possessed the kind of selfless bravery that could inspire entire armies and the humble wisdom that could wield ultimate power without being corrupted by it. The goddess began to prepare this chosen champion for trials that would test every aspect of his character and strength. She guided him through adventures that would teach him the skills he would need for the battles ahead, while also ensuring that he learned the deeper lesson that true strength comes not from individual prowess, but from love and determination to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As the day of final confrontation approached, Hylia made one last gift to the world she loved: the creation of a weapon that could channel divine power through mortal hands without overwhelming the one who wielded it. The Master Sword, forged from materials that existed at the boundary between divine and mortal realms, would serve as both blade and seal, capable of cutting through the deepest darkness, while also containing evil that could not be permanently destroyed. The goddess poured into this sacred weapon not only her divine essence, but also her love for all mortal life, creating a blade that would respond not to ambition or hatred, but only to the pure intention to protect the innocent. The Master Sword would choose its own wielders across the ages, recognizing those hearts that had achieved the perfect balance between strength and compassion that made them worthy of such responsibility. When Demise finally emerged from his subterranean kingdom, with an army that darkened the sky and shook the foundations of the earth, he found not the unprepared and defenseless world he had expected, but rather a civilization that had been forged in adversity and strengthened by divine wisdom. The surface dwellers had learned to fight not as individuals seeking personal glory, but as a unified force dedicated to preserving everything good and beautiful in their world. The war that followed was unlike anything that had been seen since the original creation of the world. It was not merely a conflict between opposing armies, but a fundamental struggle between the principles of creation and destruction, order and chaos, love and hatred. Every battle was fought on multiple levels simultaneously, as physical combat was accompanied by spiritual warfare that determined whether hope or despair would reign in the hearts of those who fought. Hylia, still in her divine form but knowing that her time as a goddess was drawing to a close, led the forces of light with wisdom and compassion that inspired even the most frightened civilians to acts of desperate heroism. She moved through the battlefield like living starlight, her presence healing the wounded and strengthening the courage of all who fought beside her. Yet even her divine power was not sufficient to turn the tide decisively against an enemy that had been specifically designed to counter heavenly intervention. Demise's malice was so concentrated and ancient that it could corrupt even sacred ground, while his armies seemed to grow stronger with every victory they achieved, feeding on the despair and destruction they left in their wake. The turning point of the war came when Hylia made the most radical decision of her existence. Rather than continue to fight as a goddess, limited by the cosmic balance that prevented her from unleashing her full power, she chose to transform herself into something unprecedented in the history of creation. A mortal being who retained divine essence, a bridge between heaven and earth that could channel ultimate power through finite form. But such a transformation could not be accomplished while maintaining her current existence. Hylia's sacrifice would require her to die as a goddess in order to be reborn as a mortal, trusting in forces beyond even her divine understanding to ensure that her essential nature would survive the transition. It was an act of faith that went beyond anything that had ever been attempted, a leap into the unknown that could save the world or destroy the last hope of victory. The ritual that accomplished this unprecedented transformation was witnessed by Link and a small circle of the most trusted champions, though none of them fully understood what they were seeing. In a sacred grove where the boundary between mortal and divine realms was thinnest, Hylia began the process of deliberately ending her immortal existence, her divine essence slowly condensing into a form that could be sustained by mortal flesh. The goddess's death was not the end of consciousness, but rather a metamorphosis so profound that it redefined the very nature of what was possible for both divine and mortal beings. As her immortal form dissolved into streams of golden light, that same light began to coalesce around the soul of a Hylian child who had not yet been born, infusing mortal flesh with divine consciousness in a union that had never been attempted before. This child would bear the name Zelda, the first of a bloodline that would carry the goddess's essence through countless generations, each incarnation retaining the potential to access divine power while remaining fundamentally mortal in nature. Through this sacrifice, Hylia had ensured that the power needed to seal ultimate evil would always be available to the world, while also guaranteeing that such power could never be used for selfish or destructive purposes. The transformation was not without cost, however. The goddess's divine memories and much of her accumulated wisdom were lost in the transition, leaving each incarnation of Zelda to discover her own path to awakening the power within her. This was perhaps the most painful aspect of Hylia's sacrifice, the knowledge that she would have to watch each of her future selves struggle to understand abilities and responsibilities that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Yet this limitation was also a source of strength, for it ensured that each Princess Zelda would develop her own unique perspective on how divine power should be wielded in service of mortal needs. The goddess had recognized that unchanging divine perfection, no matter how well-intentioned, could eventually become a limitation rather than a blessing. Only through constant renewal and fresh understanding could the forces of light remain strong enough to face whatever new forms darkness might take across the ages. The immediate aftermath of Hylia's transformation marked the beginning of the end for Demise's rebellion against creation. The Demon King had prepared to face divine opposition, but the combination of mortal determination and divine power that now stood against him was something entirely outside his experience. Link, wielding the Master Sword that had been charged with the goddess's final blessing, proved capable of striking blows that could actually harm the seemingly invulnerable embodiment of entropy. The final battle between the forces of creation and destruction took place not on any earthly battlefield, but in a realm that existed between dimensions, where the fundamental principles that governed reality could engage in direct conflict without destroying the physical world in the process. Here, in a space where thought became solid and will shape the landscape itself, the ultimate confrontation played out according to rules that had been established at the very beginning of time. Link faced Demise not merely as a warrior seeking victory in combat, but as a representative of everything good and noble that mortal life could achieve. His courage was not the absence of fear, but the presence of love strong enough to overcome any terror. His skill with the sacred blade was not mere physical prowess, but the perfect expression of his dedication to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Demon King, for his part, represented not just his own malicious will, but the accumulated hatred and despair of every act of cruelty and destruction that had ever occurred in the world. He was entropy, given consciousness, the inevitable ending toward which all systems naturally moved, the final darkness that would claim every star and extinguish every flame. Yet in the end, it was not strength that decided the battle's outcome, but rather the nature of the forces that each combatant represented. Creation, by its very essence, was generative and expansive, capable of infinite growth and renewal. Destruction, no matter how powerful, was ultimately limited by the fact that it could only work with what already existed, reducing complexity to simplicity until there was nothing left to destroy. When Link struck the final blow that shattered Demise's physical form, he was not simply winning a fight, but demonstrating a fundamental truth about the nature of existence itself. Love and courage, when perfectly united, possessed the power to triumph over any force of destruction, no matter how ancient or seemingly invincible. But Demise's defeat, while decisive, was not complete annihilation. Beings of such fundamental cosmic significance could not simply cease to exist, for they represented principles that were woven into the very structure of reality itself. Instead of dying, the Demon King was sealed away in the Master Sword itself, contained within the sacred blade where his malice could be slowly purified by the divine essence that permeated the weapon. With his final breath, Demise spoke a curse that would echo through all the ages to come. The spirits of the hero and the goddess, he declared, would be forever bound to his own in an eternal cycle of conflict and reincarnation. Whenever his malice grew strong enough to threaten the world again, the souls of Link and Zelda would return to face him once more, their battle playing out across the centuries in new forms, but with the same fundamental stakes. This curse, terrible as it seemed, was perhaps also a blessing in disguise. It ensured that no matter what forms evil might take in future ages, there would always be champions ready to stand against it. The cycle of heroism that Demise had intended as a condemnation became instead a promise that hope would never truly die, no matter how dark the world might become. In the aftermath of victory, as the surviving defenders of creation began to rebuild their shattered civilization, Princess Zelda, for she had indeed been born during the final battle, her consciousness awakening as Demise fell, took up the responsibility of establishing the first true kingdom of Hyrule. This would not be merely a collection of allied settlements, but a unified realm dedicated to the principles that had made victory possible: cooperation, courage, wisdom, and above all, the understanding that strength comes not from power over others, but from the willingness to sacrifice for their protection. The kingdom that Zelda established would serve as a model for all future ages of how mortal beings could create societies worthy of divine blessing. It would be a place where different races could live in harmony, where knowledge was shared freely, where the strong protected the weak, and where every individual was valued for their unique contribution to the common good. Yet even as she worked to build this better world, the first Princess Zelda remained aware that her victory was not a permanent solution, but rather the beginning of an eternal vigil. Somewhere in the depths of the Master Sword, Demise's malice still pulsed with patient hatred, waiting for the moment when it would be strong enough to break free and resume its war against creation. The goddess who had become mortal understood that each generation would face its own version of this cosmic struggle, and that each would need to find its own path to victory. She could not solve this problem for all time, but she could ensure that the tools and wisdom necessary for victory would always be available to those brave enough to take up the burden of heroism. As the sun set on the age of direct divine intervention and rose upon the first day of truly mortal history, Princess Zelda looked out over the kingdom she had helped to establish and felt something that her divine predecessor had never experienced: hope tinged with uncertainty, joy shadowed by the knowledge of mortality, love made more precious by its fragility. She had chosen to become human not in spite of these limitations, but because of them, understanding that the greatest victories were won not by perfect beings incapable of failure, but by flawed mortals who chose to be better than they had to be. The cycle of heroism had begun, and with it, the eternal promise that as long as courage and love existed in mortal hearts, the light would never truly fade from the world. In the generations that followed the establishment of the first kingdom of Hyrule, As Princess Zelda's descendants worked to build upon the foundations she had laid, and the memory of Demise's defeat gradually transformed from lived experience into cherished legend, there emerged from among the diverse peoples of the realm a group whose devotion to the goddess and her mortal incarnation transcended ordinary religious observance and approached the realm of mystical communion. These were the Sheikah, the shadow folk, whose very name would become synonymous with loyalty so absolute that it bordered on the supernatural and wisdom so profound that it seemed to touch the boundaries of divine understanding. They were not born different from other Hylians in any fundamental sense, but rather chose to transform themselves through disciplines so rigorous and dedication so complete that they gradually developed abilities that set them apart from the rest of mortal creation. The origins of the Sheikah as a distinct people lay not in bloodline or birthplace, but in a shared revelation that occurred during the darkest hours of the war against Demise. When the goddess Hylia had made her ultimate sacrifice, choosing to abandon her divine form in order to become mortal, a small group of her most devoted followers experienced visions so vivid and transformative that they felt called to dedicate their entire existence to serving her reincarnated essence in whatever form it might take across the ages. These first shadow folk understood with startling clarity that the victory over the Demon King was not an ending, but a beginning, the first movement in an eternal symphony that would play out across countless generations. They recognized that each age would bring its own trials and tribulations, its own manifestations of the darkness that could never be permanently destroyed, and that the princess who carried Hylia's essence would need protectors who could match any threat with wisdom, skill, and unwavering dedication. The early Sheikah established their first hidden settlements in remote mountain valleys where they could practice their developing arts without drawing unwanted attention from those who might fear or misunderstand their growing abilities. These communities were built according to principles that reflected their deep understanding of both the physical and spiritual aspects of existence, with every building positioned to channel natural energy flows, and every pathway designed to facilitate meditation and contemplation. Within these secluded sanctuaries, the shadow folk began to develop the unique combination of mystical practice and practical training that would define their culture for millennia to come. They studied the ancient texts that preserved Hylia's teachings, learning to interpret not just the literal meanings of her words, but also the deeper spiritual truths that lay hidden beneath the surface of conventional understanding. More remarkably still, they began to discover that intense spiritual discipline could actually alter the fundamental nature of mortal flesh, unlocking capabilities that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of human existence. Through meditation practices that could last for days or even weeks, they learned to slow their heartbeats to barely perceptible rhythms, to exist for extended periods without food or water, and to perceive frequencies of light and sound that remained invisible and inaudible to ordinary senses. The most dedicated among them developed the ability to manipulate their own physical presence in ways that seemed to defy natural law. They could move so quietly that even trained animals would not detect their passage, blend with shadows so completely that they became virtually invisible even in bright daylight, and strike with such precision and speed that their movements appeared to blur the line between the physical and the supernatural. Yet these remarkable abilities were never pursued as ends in themselves, but rather as tools in service of their greater purpose. Every technique the Sheikah mastered, every power they developed, was evaluated according to a single criterion. Would it better enable them to protect and serve the goddess's bloodline and the kingdom she had established? Nothing that did not serve this ultimate goal was considered worthy of their attention, no matter how impressive or personally satisfying it might have been. As the decades passed and their abilities continued to develop, the Sheikah began to establish a presence within the royal court itself, serving as advisors, protectors, and keepers of secrets that were too dangerous for general knowledge. They became the hidden foundation upon which the kingdom's security rested, the unseen guardians, whose vigilance allowed the visible symbols of authority to function with confidence and effectiveness. The Shadow Folk developed an intelligence network so comprehensive and subtle that they could monitor potential threats from across the known world while remaining virtually undetectable themselves. They placed agents in every major settlement, established communication systems that could carry messages across vast distances with remarkable speed, and created archives of information so detailed that they could predict political developments and social changes with uncanny accuracy. But perhaps their greatest achievement during these early centuries was the gradual development of what could only be described as a fusion of magic and technology, an approach to problem solving that drew equally upon spiritual insight and practical engineering. The Sheikah discovered that certain materials, when shaped according to principles derived from their mystical studies, could channel and focus energy in ways that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between the physical and the metaphysical. Their first experiments in this direction were relatively simple devices designed to enhance their natural abilities rather than replace them. They created lenses that could reveal hidden magical auras, fabrics that could bend light around the wearer to create near-perfect camouflage, and blades that could hold enchantments with a stability and permanence that amazed even the most learned scholars of the age. As their understanding deepened, however, the Sheikah began to envision possibilities that would have seemed like pure fantasy to any other culture. They theorized that it might be possible to create artificial beings that could think and act independently while remaining absolutely loyal to their creators. They proposed devices that could manipulate time itself, slowing or accelerating the flow of moments to provide strategic advantages in combat or research. Most ambitiously of all, they began to develop plans for machines that could channel divine energy directly, creating technological marvels that would possess some measure of the same power that flowed through the goddess's bloodline. These would not be mere tools, but rather partners in the eternal struggle against darkness, artificial beings that could serve as extensions of the royal will while possessing the intelligence and adaptability necessary to function independently when circumstances required it. The theoretical foundation for these incredible achievements lay in the Sheikah's unique understanding of the relationship between consciousness and reality. Through their mystical practices, they had discovered that the boundary between mind and matter was far more permeable than most people realized, and that sufficiently focused intention could actually reshape the physical world in ways that seemed to violate natural law. This insight led them to develop techniques for imbuing inanimate objects with something approaching consciousness, creating tools and weapons that could learn from experience and adapt their functions to meet changing needs. A Sheikah blade might remember the fighting style of its wielder and adjust its balance accordingly, while a communication device could modify its transmission patterns to avoid detection by hostile forces. The process of creating such enhanced objects required not only technical skill, but also a form of spiritual communion between the craftsman and the material being shaped. The Sheikah artisan had to understand not just the physical properties of metal and crystal, but also their deeper spiritual essence, learning to work in harmony with natural forces rather than simply imposing artificial patterns upon them. As word of these achievements began to spread among the royal court and the broader population of the kingdom, reactions were decidedly mixed. Many people were amazed and grateful for the protection that Sheikah innovations provided, recognizing that these technological marvels represented a significant advantage in the ongoing struggle to maintain peace and prosperity. The ability to communicate instantly across vast distances to detect threats long before they became dangerous, and to respond to crises with unprecedented speed and precision was clearly beneficial to everyone who lived under the kingdom's protection. Others, however, began to express concern about the implications of power so great that it seemed to approach the realm of divine authority. They worried that mortal beings, no matter how well-intentioned, might not be capable of wielding such abilities without eventually being corrupted by them. History was filled with examples of good people who had been transformed into tyrants by the gradual accumulation of power that exceeded their wisdom or moral strength. More troubling still were the philosophical questions raised by the Sheikah's achievements. If artificial beings could be created that possessed intelligence and consciousness, what distinguished them from natural life forms? If technology could manipulate time and space in ways that had previously been the exclusive province of divine intervention, what did that mean for the traditional understanding of the relationship between mortal and divine realms? These concerns remained largely theoretical, however, as long as the Sheikah continued to demonstrate absolute loyalty to the royal family and unwavering dedication to the kingdom's welfare. Their innovations were clearly being used for defensive rather than aggressive purposes. Their agents operated with remarkable restraint and respect for the rights of innocent citizens, and their leaders continued to submit themselves to royal authority without question or hesitation. The true test of their character came during a period of unprecedented crisis that threatened not just the kingdom of Hyrule, but the entire world, with a return to the chaos that had preceded the Golden Goddess's work of creation. Ancient texts had long spoken of a cycle of destruction and renewal that operated on a timescale so vast that most people dismissed it as purely mythological. But the Sheikah's careful observations of celestial movements and energy patterns had led them to conclude that this cycle was both real and approaching a critical phase. The signs were subtle at first, visible only to those who had trained themselves to perceive the deepest currents of spiritual energy that flowed through the world. The aurora that danced across the northern skies began to pulse with unusual colors and patterns. Sensitive individuals reported dreams that seemed to come from outside their own consciousness, filled with images of vast mechanical forms moving beneath layers of earth and stone. Animals exhibited behavioral changes that suggested they were responding to stimuli that remained undetectable to human senses. As these phenomena became more pronounced, the Sheikah realized that they were witnessing the early stages of Calamity Ganon's return to active manifestation. The Demon King's malice, which had been sealed within the Master Sword for centuries, was gradually accumulating enough strength to break free from its prison and resume the war against creation that Link and Zelda had interrupted so long ago. The Shadow Folk understood with terrifying clarity that this new manifestation of ancient evil would be far more dangerous than its predecessor. Demise had been a force of pure destruction, terrible in its power but ultimately limited by its inability to create or adapt. Calamity Ganon, however, had spent centuries studying the very technology that had been used to defeat it, learning to corrupt and control the Sheikah innovations that should have been its greatest weakness. Faced with this unprecedented threat, the Sheikah made the decision to accelerate their research and development programs beyond anything that had been attempted before. They poured all of their accumulated knowledge and resources into the creation of a defensive network so comprehensive and powerful that it could contain even the evolved form of their ancient enemy. The centerpiece of this grand design was the construction of 4 massive mechanical beings that would come to be known as the Divine Beasts, each one a mobile fortress capable of channeling divine energy on a scale that dwarfed even their most ambitious previous achievements. These were not mere machines, but rather artificial beings that possessed something approaching divine consciousness, created through techniques that pushed the boundaries of both technology and spirituality to their absolute limits. Each divine beast was designed to embody the characteristics of one of the kingdom's major races, serving both as a symbol of unity and as a practical recognition that the coming battle would require the cooperation of all peoples if victory was to be achieved. Varuta took the form of a great mechanical elephant, its trunk capable of manipulating water with the precision and power that the Zora people had long associated with their connection to aquatic elements. Varudania resembled a massive salamander, its body designed to operate in the extreme heat and harsh conditions of Death Mountain where the Gorons made their homes. The divine beast could not only survive in environments that would destroy lesser machines, but actually draw power from the volcanic forces that surrounded it, converting thermal energy into the spiritual force needed to channel divine blessing. Varmedo soared through the skies on mechanical wings that seemed to capture the very essence of flight, embodying the freedom and perspective that the Rito people valued above all other qualities. This aerial divine beast could provide reconnaissance and tactical support across vast distances, while also serving as a mobile platform for weapons systems that could strike with the precision of a master archer. Varnaboris stalked across the desert sands like a great mechanical camel, its form perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of the Gerudo homeland, while also incorporating the fierce pride and lightning-fast reflexes that characterized the warrior women who ruled those lands. The divine beast could generate and control electrical storms with power that rivaled natural phenomena. But the divine beasts represented only the most visible aspect of the Sheikah's defensive preparations. Throughout the kingdom, they constructed a network of smaller guardian units that could respond automatically to threats without requiring human operators. These guardians were built according to a spider-like design that provided maximum mobility and stability, while also creating multiple mounting points for weapon systems that could adapt to different tactical situations. Each guardian was equipped with an energy weapon that could fire beams of concentrated light, with enough power to pierce through the thickest armor or reduce solid stone to vapor. More importantly, these weapons were specifically calibrated to disrupt the kind of malicious energy that emanated from corrupted beings, making them incredibly effective against the monster armies that traditionally accompanied manifestations of ancient evil. The Sheikah also constructed a series of testing facilities that they called shrines, hidden throughout the kingdom and designed to preserve their knowledge and techniques for future generations. Each shrine contained trials and puzzles that would teach worthy individuals to master specific aspects of Sheikah technology, ensuring that even if their civilization was somehow destroyed, the tools needed to combat darkness would remain available to future heroes. These shrines were marvels of engineering that operated according to principles that seemed to transcend normal understanding of space and time. Their interiors were larger than their exteriors should have been able to contain. Their mechanisms could function for millennia without maintenance or external power sources, and their testing protocols could adapt automatically to the abilities and needs of each individual who entered them. The construction of this vast defensive network required resources and coordination on a scale that had never been attempted before in the history of the kingdom. Entire mountains were hollowed out to create manufacturing facilities. Rivers were diverted to provide power for massive forges, and the most skilled artisans and engineers from every race worked together in projects that pushed the boundaries of what seemed physically possible. Yet despite the incredible scope of their undertaking, the Sheikah never lost sight of the spiritual dimension of their work. Every guardian was blessed by priests before activation. Every divine beast was consecrated according to ancient rituals that had been preserved since the time of Hylia herself, and every shrine was established as a sacred space where the boundaries between technological achievement and divine blessing became meaningless. The Shadow Folk understood that their creations would be effective against the calamity only if they remained true to the principles of love and protection that had motivated their construction. Machines built for purely military purposes, no matter how powerful, would eventually be corrupted by the very evil they were designed to combat. Only technology that embodied the highest spiritual ideals could hope to stand against malice that had been accumulating power for centuries. As their great work neared completion, the Sheikah began to train pilots for the divine beasts, selecting candidates not merely for their technical skills, but for their moral character and spiritual development. These champions would need to form a mystical bond with their mechanical partners, learning to think and act in perfect harmony with beings that existed at the intersection of consciousness and machine intelligence. The process of establishing this connection required months of preparation and meditation, as human and artificial consciousness learned to complement each other in ways that had never been attempted before. The pilot had to surrender their ego sufficiently to allow the divine beast's intelligence to enhance their decision-making, while the machine had to develop enough empathy to understand and respond to human emotional needs. When the training was complete and the bonds fully established, the resulting partnerships represented something entirely new in the history of the world, a perfect fusion of mortal courage and artificial wisdom that could respond to threats with capabilities that exceeded what either component could achieve independently. The champions and their divine beasts became living symbols of the unity and cooperation that the kingdom of Hyrule represented at its best. The Sheikah's preparations proved to be both remarkably prescient and tragically insufficient when Calamity Ganon finally emerged from its long imprisonment. The Shadow Folk had correctly anticipated that this manifestation of ancient evil would be more cunning and adaptable than its predecessor, but they had underestimated the depth of its patience and the thoroughness of its planning. The Calamity had indeed spent its centuries of imprisonment studying Sheikah technology, but it had done more than simply learn to resist their weapons and defenses. It had developed the ability to corrupt and control their creations, turning the very tools that had been built to protect the kingdom into instruments of its own malicious will. When the great machines that should have been humanity's salvation instead became harbingers of destruction, when the guardians that had been programmed to protect innocent life began systematically exterminating the population, the Sheikah faced the most profound crisis of their existence. Everything they had worked for, every innovation they had developed, every sacrifice they had made in service of their sacred duty had been turned against the very people they had sworn to protect. The psychological impact of this betrayal was so devastating that many Sheikah lost their sanity entirely, unable to reconcile their absolute dedication to protection with the reality that their greatest achievements had become instruments of mass murder. Some chose to end their own lives rather than witness the continuation of horrors that their own hands had made possible. Yet even in this darkest hour, the Shadow Folk's fundamental character remained unchanged. Those who retained their sanity began immediately to search for ways to counter the corruption that had claimed their creations, working with desperate determination to find some method of restoring their machines to their original purpose. Their efforts were ultimately successful, though the victory came at a price so terrible that it would haunt the survivors for generations. Princess Zelda's awakening of her divine powers not only defeated Calamity Ganon, but also purged the malicious influence from most of the corrupted technology, restoring the guardians and divine beasts to their intended function. But the damage to the Sheikah people themselves was irreversible. Their numbers had been decimated during the Great Calamity, their hidden settlements destroyed, and their accumulated knowledge scattered or lost. Most tragically of all, the trust between the Shadow Folk and the broader population of the kingdom had been shattered by the revelation of just how dangerous their innovations could become when corrupted by evil. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, Many survivors chose to abandon their ancestral practices entirely, seeking to live as ordinary citizens, rather than continuing to bear the burden of abilities that had proven so vulnerable to corruption. Others retreated to even more remote locations, establishing new hidden communities where they could preserve what remained of their traditions, while avoiding the suspicion and fear that now surrounded their people. A small number, however, made a different choice entirely. These Shaker, embittered by what they perceived as the ingratitude of those they had tried to protect, abandoned their loyalty to the royal family and the kingdom itself. They would eventually form the core of what would become known as the Yiga clan, dedicated to serving the very evil that their ancestors had fought against for so many centuries. The transformation of former protectors into active enemies represented perhaps the most tragic consequence of the Great Calamity's corruption. These fallen Sheikah retained all of their ancestral skills and knowledge, but now used them in service of destruction rather than protection. Their existence would serve as a constant reminder of how even the purest intentions could be perverted by exposure to sufficient malice and despair. For those Sheikah who remained true to their original purpose, the long years that followed the Great Calamity were a time of patient rebuilding and careful preparation. They understood that their great machines would be needed again when the cycle of conflict resumed, and they worked tirelessly to preserve the knowledge and techniques that would make such technology possible for future generations. The Shadow Folk established new training programs that emphasized not just technical skill but also spiritual resilience, recognizing that their greatest weakness had been their failure to adequately protect their creations from corruption. They developed meditation practices specifically designed to detect and resist malicious influence, and created safeguards that would make it much more difficult for future innovations to be turned against their creators. Most importantly, they began to record their accumulated wisdom in forms that could survive even the complete destruction of their civilization, creating archives hidden in locations so remote and well protected that they would remain undisturbed for centuries. These repositories would ensure that when the next hero arose to face the return of ancient evil, the tools and knowledge needed for victory would be available despite any catastrophe that might befall the Sheikah themselves. The legacy of the Shadow Folk became a paradox that would echo through all the ages of the world's history. Their greatest achievement had also been their greatest failure. Their most generous gift to humanity had become the source of humanity's most terrible suffering, and their absolute loyalty had ultimately given birth to bitter enemies who would plague the kingdom for generations to come. Yet through all the centuries that followed, the surviving Sheikah never wavered in their commitment to the principles that had originally motivated their transformation from ordinary Hylians into something approaching divine guardians. They remained the unseen protectors of wisdom and knowledge, the patient keepers of technologies that would be needed when darkness returned, and above all, the living embodiment of the truth that even the most devastating failure could not negate the essential value of a life dedicated to protecting others. In the quiet villages where they made their new homes, far from the centers of power and attention, the Shadow Folk continued their eternal vigil. They watched and waited, preserved and prepared, carrying within their hearts the unshakable faith that someday, somehow, their sacrifice would be vindicated, and their great work would finally achieve the purpose for which it had always been intended. The age of Sheikah dominance had ended in tragedy, but the age of Sheikah wisdom was just beginning. Long before the Sheikah had established their hidden sanctuaries in the mountain valleys of the surface world, before the first Hylian settlements had learned to work metal or cultivate grain, there existed a civilization so ancient and mysterious that even the longest-lived Zora could preserve only fragmentary memories of their achievements. These were the Zonai, a people whose very name would become synonymous with wisdom so profound that it seemed to transcend the normal limitations of mortal understanding, and whose legacy would endure long after their physical forms had passed beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence. The origins of the Zonai lay not in the familiar landscapes of Hyrule's surface, but high among the floating islands that drifted like stone clouds through the upper reaches of the atmosphere, tethered to the earth below by forces so subtle and complex that even their creators did not fully comprehend the mechanisms that kept their aerial realm stable. These sky islands were not mere chunks of rock suspended by magic, but rather carefully cultivated environments where the boundary between natural and artificial had been so thoroughly dissolved that they represented something entirely new in the history of creation. The Zonai had discovered, through means that remained mysterious even to their own descendants, techniques for manipulating what they called the spiral force, a fundamental energy that flowed through all matter and consciousness, like the hidden current that connects every living thing to every other. This was not the crude manipulation of elemental forces that characterized most magical practices, but rather a sophisticated understanding of the deepest patterns that governed reality itself. Their architecture reflected this profound comprehension of cosmic harmony, with every structure built according to mathematical principles that seemed to mirror the hidden geometries that determined how galaxies spiraled through space and how consciousness organized itself within living minds. The Zonai buildings were not simply functional spaces for habitation or work, but rather three-dimensional expressions of philosophical concepts, so advanced that most observers could perceive only their aesthetic beauty, while remaining unconscious of their deeper meaning. The spiral motif that appeared in every aspect of Zonai design was far more than mere artistic preference or cultural tradition. These ancient people had recognized that the spiral represented the fundamental pattern through which all growth and development occurred, from the unfurling of a fern frond to the expansion of awareness within a maturing consciousness. By incorporating this pattern into their technology and architecture, they were able to create systems that evolved and adapted according to natural principles, rather than requiring constant maintenance and modification. The floating islands themselves were perhaps the greatest expression of this philosophy made manifest in physical form. Each aerial realm was designed as a complete ecosystem that could sustain itself indefinitely through careful balance of all its component elements. Plants were cultivated not merely for their practical utility, but for their ability to process atmospheric energy in ways that contributed to the overall stability of the island's suspension systems. Animals were integrated into the environment, not as separate creatures sharing a common space, but as active participants in a grand symphony of interconnected relationships. The Zonai, who inhabited these floating realms, possessed physical characteristics that distinguished them from the other races of the world, though these differences were as much the result of their spiritual development as their genetic heritage. They were tall and lean, with elongated limbs that seemed designed for movement through three-dimensional space rather than mere surface locomotion. Their eyes held depths that suggested they perceived layers of reality that remained invisible to ordinary sight, while their voices carried harmonics that could resonate with the fundamental frequencies that held their sky islands aloft. Most remarkably of all, the Zonai had developed a symbiotic relationship with beings that resembled dragons but possessed intelligence and wisdom that far exceeded that of any mere animal. These great serpentine creatures, whose scales seemed to contain trapped starlight and whose breath could reshape the very air through which they moved, served not as servants or mounts, but as partners in the great work of understanding and manipulating the forces that governed existence. The relationship between Zonai and dragon was so intimate and profound that observers from other races often had difficulty determining where one consciousness ended and the other began. The dragons could understand and respond to Zonai thoughts and emotions, with a sensitivity that suggested telepathic communication, while the Zonai seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of draconic perspectives that allowed them to perceive the world through senses evolved for flight and the manipulation of atmospheric currents. This partnership enabled the Zonai to develop transportation systems that were both practical and transcendent, allowing them to travel vast distances through the air, while also serving as moving meditation practices that enhanced their understanding of the spiral force. Riding a dragon was not simply a means of getting from one place to another, but rather a form of communion with the fundamental energies that connected all aspects of existence. The technology that the Zonai developed through their understanding of spiral force principles was unlike anything created by any other civilization in the history of the world. They crafted devices that seemed to operate according to principles that transcended the normal boundaries between matter and energy, consciousness and mechanism, individual and collective awareness. These were not machines in any conventional sense, but rather crystallized expressions of natural law that could channel and focus cosmic forces in ways that seemed to border on miraculous. Their construction techniques were based on an understanding of how to work with materials at the level of their fundamental structure, reshaping stone and metal, not through force or heat, but through harmonic resonances that could convince matter to adopt new configurations as naturally as a flower opens to the sunday. The resulting objects possessed a quality that was simultaneously organic and crystalline, soft and hard, permanent and adaptable, depending on the needs of the moment. The Zonai created tools that could think and adapt, buildings that could grow and repair themselves, and transportation devices that could navigate through space and time, according to principles that remained incomprehensible to less advanced civilizations. Yet all of these achievements were guided by a philosophy that emphasized harmony with natural forces rather than domination over them, cooperation rather than conquest, understanding rather than mere manipulation. Their society was organized according to principles that reflected their deep understanding of how consciousness develops and matures over time. Rather than rigid hierarchies based on birth or wealth, the Zonai structured their communities around the recognition that every individual possessed unique insights and capabilities that could contribute to the collective wisdom of the group. Leadership roles were fluid and contextual, with different people taking responsibility for decisions based on their particular areas of expertise and spiritual development. The Zonai educational system was based on the understanding that true knowledge could not be simply transferred from teacher to student, but had to be discovered and integrated through direct experience. Young Zonai were not lectured about the nature of reality, but rather guided through carefully designed experiences that allowed them to discover fundamental principles through their own observations and insights. This approach created individuals who possessed not just information but genuine understanding, not just techniques but wisdom. Their spiritual practices were inseparable from their daily activities, as they had recognized that the boundaries between sacred and mundane were artificial constructs that limited perception and hindered development. Every action, from the preparation of food to the maintenance of their sky islands, was performed with the same attention and reverence that other cultures reserved for their most solemn religious ceremonies. The Zonai understanding of time was perhaps their most revolutionary insight, as they had discovered that temporal flow was not the fixed and linear phenomenon that most beings experienced, but rather something that could be influenced and manipulated through proper understanding of its underlying structure. They developed devices that could slow or accelerate the passage of time in localized areas, creating pockets of temporal distortion that allowed for accelerated learning or extended contemplation. More remarkably still, they learned to perceive and interact with probability streams, the the multiple potential futures that branched out from every moment of decision and action. This ability allowed them to make choices that were not simply based on present circumstances, but also took into account the long-term consequences of actions across multiple possible timelines. As the centuries passed and their understanding of cosmic principles continued to deepen, the Zonai began to face a profound philosophical and practical dilemma. Their civilization had achieved levels of knowledge and capability that approached the divine, yet they remained mortal beings subject to the limitations of physical existence. They could perceive the fundamental patterns that governed reality, but they were still trapped within individual consciousness that prevented them from fully experiencing the unity that they knew lay at the heart of all existence. The solution to this dilemma, when it finally emerged from their collective contemplation, was both elegant and terrible. The Zonai discovered that it was possible to transcend the limitations of individual consciousness by merging their awareness with the cosmic forces they had spent so long studying. This transformation required the willing sacrifice of personal identity in exchange for a form of existence that was vastly expanded but no longer recognizably human. The process involved the consumption of objects they called secret stones, crystallized fragments of the spiral force that could serve as catalysts for consciousness transformation. These were not mere magical artifacts, but rather physical manifestations of the deepest principles that govern the relationship between mind and reality. To consume a secret stone was to invite one's individual awareness to dissolve into something far greater and more universal. The first Zonai to undergo this transformation was their greatest king, a being whose wisdom and understanding had made him legendary even among a people renowned for their spiritual achievements. His choice to sacrifice his personal existence for the good of his people and the world at large marked the beginning of the end for Zonai civilization as it had traditionally existed. The transformation was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. The king's physical form began to change, expanding and reshaping itself according to draconic patterns, while his consciousness merged with forces so vast and cosmic that his individual personality gradually dissolved into something that was simultaneously more and less than human. He retained his essential nature, his commitment to protection and wisdom, but these qualities now existed within a form of awareness that transcended personal desire or individual will. The great dragon that the king became was a being of incredible power and beauty, its serpentine form stretching across impossible distances, while its scales contained the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. Yet this magnificent creature was also profoundly alone, cut off from the kinds of relationships and experiences that had once given meaning to its existence as a mortal being. The king's transformation inspired other members of the Zonai royal family to make similar sacrifices, each one choosing to abandon their individual identity in order to become guardians of specific aspects of the natural world. One became a dragon of ice and winter, watching over the frozen lands, where life endured in forms so subtle and resilient that they seemed to embody hope itself. Another transformed into a being of lightning and storm, its presence ensuring that the great cycles of weather that sustained all life would continue to function properly. A third member of the royal family became a dragon of earth and growing things, its consciousness merging with the slow but irresistible forces that shaped mountains and guided the development of forests across geological ages. Each of these transformations represented not just a personal sacrifice, but a gift to future generations, as the dragons would continue their guardianship long after all other traces of Zonai civilization had faded from memory. The loss of their royal family marked the beginning of the end for Zonai society as a functioning civilization. Without the leadership and wisdom that had guided their development for so many centuries, The remaining Zonai found themselves struggling to maintain the complex systems that kept their sky islands stable and their communities functioning. The younger generation, lacking the deep understanding of spiral force principles that their elders had possessed, found it increasingly difficult to operate and maintain the sophisticated technology that their ancestors had created. More troubling still was the gradual realization that their isolation in the sky realms, while providing protection from the conflicts and corruptions of surface civilization, had also cut them off from the kinds of experiences and challenges that were necessary for continued growth and development. Their perfect aerial environments had become beautiful prisons that preserved their bodies while slowly stifling their spirits. Faced with the choice between maintaining their elevated existence in increasingly dysfunctional sky communities or abandoning their ancestral homes to seek new challenges and opportunities in the world below, many Zonai chose descent. They constructed vehicles and devices that could carry them safely to the surface world, bringing with them whatever portable remnants of their ancestral wisdom they could preserve and transport. The arrival of the Zonai refugees in surface communities created ripples of change that extended far beyond their immediate impact on local populations. These enigmatic beings brought with them technologies and perspectives that seemed almost magical to people accustomed to more conventional approaches to engineering and problem solving. Their understanding of how to work with natural forces rather than against them revolutionized agriculture, architecture, and countless other aspects of daily life. Yet the integration of Zonai wisdom into surface civilization was not without its challenges and complications. Many of their most sophisticated techniques required levels of spiritual development and philosophical understanding that took years or decades to achieve, making it difficult to pass on their knowledge to people who had not undergone similar training and preparation. More problematically, some aspects of Zonai technology were simply too powerful and potentially dangerous to be safely utilized by individuals who lacked the moral and spiritual discipline that had characterized the original Sky Dwellers. Devices that could manipulate time or probability required users who had transcended personal ambition and ego-driven desires, as the consequences of misusing such capabilities could extend across multiple generations and affect countless innocent lives. As a result, much Zonai knowledge was either lost entirely or preserved only in fragmentary forms that could be understood by later generations only through careful study and interpretation. The ruins that they left behind became mystery-shrouded monuments to achievements that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of mortal accomplishment, inspiring wonder and speculation among explorers and scholars for centuries to come. The Zonai who successfully integrated into surface communities often found that their children and grandchildren possessed only diluted versions of their ancestral abilities, as the spiritual practices and environmental conditions that had originally fostered such development were no longer available. Within a few generations, most descendants of the Sky People had become indistinguishable from other members of whatever communities they had joined, carrying only faint genetic memories of their extraordinary heritage. Yet, the influence of Zonai wisdom continued to shape the development of surface civilization in subtle but profound ways. Their understanding of spiral patterns and cosmic harmonies influenced the development of architectural styles that would endure for millennia, while their insights into the relationship between consciousness and reality provided the theoretical foundation for magical practices that would be refined and expanded by future generations of scholars and mystics. Most significantly, their example of willing self-sacrifice for the greater good established a philosophical and spiritual precedent that would inspire countless acts of heroism and selfless service in the ages to come. The dragons that the Zonai royal family had become served not only as guardians of natural forces, but as living symbols of the truth that the highest form of love sometimes required the complete abandonment of personal desires and individual identity. The three great dragons continued their eternal vigil over the world, their serpentine forms occasionally visible to those who knew how to look for them, as they moved through hidden currents of air and energy that connected all aspects of existence. They were no longer Zonai in any meaningful sense, having transcended the limitations of racial and cultural identity, yet they retained something essential of the wisdom and compassion that had characterized their people at their greatest. To encounter one of these magnificent beings was to experience a form of communication that transcended ordinary language, as they could share wisdom and understanding through direct consciousness, contact that bypassed the usual limitations of verbal expression. Those rare individuals who were blessed with such encounters often found their entire worldview transformed, gaining insights into the nature of reality that would guide and inspire them for the rest of their lives. The dragon's presence in the world served as a constant reminder that the boundaries between mortal and divine, individual and cosmic, temporary and eternal, were far more fluid than most people realized. They embodied the ultimate expression of the Zonai understanding that true wisdom required the willingness to transcend personal limitations in service of something greater than oneself. As the ages passed, and the memory of the Zonai gradually faded from active historical consciousness, their ruins became increasingly mysterious and exotic to explorers who stumbled upon them in remote corners of the world. The spiral patterns that decorated their ancient structures seemed to pulse with hidden significance, while the devices they had left behind occasionally demonstrated capabilities that seemed to violate natural law. Scholars who studied these remnants developed countless theories about the civilization that had created them, but none could fully comprehend the depth of wisdom and understanding that the spiral motifs and crystalline technologies represented. The Zonai had operated according to principles that were so advanced and subtle that they could be grasped only through the kind of spiritual development that required lifetimes of dedicated practice and meditation. Yet even incomplete understanding of Zonai achievements proved valuable to later civilizations that were struggling with their own challenges and limitations. Engineers who studied the ruins learned techniques for creating structures that could adapt and repair themselves, while philosophers found inspiration in the evidence that mortal beings could achieve levels of understanding that approached divine comprehension. The secret stones that the royal family had consumed in their transformation were never found by later explorers, suggesting that these powerful artifacts had either been destroyed in the transformation process or had somehow transcended physical existence along with their users. This was perhaps fortunate, as the temptation to utilize such objects without proper preparation and spiritual development might have led to catastrophes that could have affected entire civilizations. The ultimate legacy of the Zonai civilization was not to be found in any physical artifact or technological achievement, but rather in the living example they had provided of a people who had chosen wisdom over power, harmony over domination, and selfless service over personal aggrandizement. Their willingness to sacrifice everything they had achieved in order to serve the greater good established a standard of nobility and spiritual development that would inspire heroes and sages for countless generations. In the quiet moments when the wind carried strange harmonics that seemed to echo with ancient wisdom, when explorers discovered ruins that seemed to glow with inner light, when scholars puzzled over technologies that operated according to principles beyond current understanding, the presence of the Zonai could still be felt in the world. They had not disappeared, but rather had transformed into something that transcended the normal boundaries of existence, becoming part of the eternal mystery that connected all aspects of reality in patterns too vast and beautiful for ordinary comprehension. The age of the Zonai had ended not in defeat or decline, but in transcendence, their greatest achievement being not what they had built, but what they had become. In choosing to abandon individual identity for cosmic consciousness, they had demonstrated the ultimate expression of the spiral wisdom that had guided their civilization from its earliest beginnings. They had learned to let go of everything they had been in order to become everything they were capable of being, leaving behind a legacy that would continue to inspire and guide the world long after their physical forms had passed beyond the reach of mortal perception. The dragons still flew through hidden currents above the clouds, their serpentine forms carrying within them all the accumulated wisdom and love of a civilization that had chosen eternity over temporal achievement. And in their eternal flight, they served as guardians not only of natural forces but of the truth that love, when perfected through wisdom and selfless service, could transcend every limitation and achieve forms of beauty that would endure long after the stars themselves had faded from the sky. In the ages that followed the establishment of the first kingdom of Hyrule, when the memory of Demise's defeat had softened into legend, and the vigilance born of that great conflict had gradually relaxed into the comfortable assumption that such ancient evils belonged firmly in the past, there arose among the scattered tribes of humanity a group whose hunger for power would ultimately challenge the very foundations of the ordered world that the golden goddesses had created. These people called themselves many names across the generations, but they would be remembered in the darkest chapters of history as the interlopers, a designation that spoke not merely to their eventual exile from the realm of light, but to their fundamental rejection of the natural order that governed the relationship between mortal ambition and divine authority. They were not born evil in any simple sense, nor did they begin their long journey toward corruption with malicious intent, but rather started as seekers of knowledge who gradually lost their way in the labyrinthine paths of forbidden wisdom. The origins of what would eventually become the Dark Tribe lay in the natural human tendency to question and explore, drives that had produced many of the greatest achievements in art, philosophy, and magical understanding that had ever graced the world. These early seekers were scholars and mystics who had grown dissatisfied with the limitations that seemed to constrain mortal existence, visionaries who believed that the boundaries between human and divine were not absolute barriers but rather challenges to be overcome through sufficient dedication and understanding. Their initial researches were both innocent and admirable, focused on understanding the deeper principles that governed magical phenomena and the hidden connections that linked consciousness to the fundamental forces of reality. They studied the ancient texts that preserved fragments of divine wisdom, conducted experiments in controlled environments where they could safely test their theories, and gathered in scholarly communities where they could share their discoveries and debate their interpretations of cosmic law. The first breakthrough that set them on their eventual path to corruption came through their investigation of shadow magic, a discipline that had been largely neglected by mainstream magical practitioners due to its association with concealment and misdirection, rather than the more direct and apparently noble applications of elemental manipulation. The interlopers discovered that shadow was not merely the absence of light, but rather a fundamental force in its own right, one that could be shaped and directed according to principles that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of space and time. Through careful study and experimentation, they learned to step between shadows as easily as ordinary people walk through doorways, to become invisible, not through illusion, but through actual manipulation of the boundary between light and darkness, and to influence events from hidden vantage points where their presence could not be detected by conventional means. These abilities, while potentially dangerous if misused, were not inherently corrupting and could have been developed in ways that served beneficial purposes. The crucial turning point came when their research led them to discover references to artifacts of incredible power that had been hidden away by previous civilizations, objects that could supposedly grant their wielders abilities that approached those of the golden goddesses themselves. The prospect of accessing such power proved irresistibly tempting to minds that had already begun to chafe under the constraints of mortal limitation, and they began to organize expeditions to locate and claim these legendary treasures. Their search took them to ruins scattered across the most remote and dangerous regions of the world, ancient sites where civilizations had risen and fallen according to cycles so vast that their individual histories had been forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars. In these forgotten places, they found fragments of knowledge and pieces of technology that seemed to confirm their most ambitious theories about the nature of reality and the possibilities for transcending mortal boundaries. Yet with each discovery, with each artifact claimed, and each forbidden technique mastered, the seekers found themselves changing in ways that they initially dismissed as natural consequences of their expanding understanding. Their appearance began to alter, with their skin taking on a greyish pallor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, while their eyes developed a luminescence that suggested they were learning to perceive frequencies of reality that remained invisible to ordinary sight. More troubling were the changes in their attitudes and relationships with others. Where they had once been generous in sharing their knowledge with fellow scholars, they became increasingly secretive and possessive of their discoveries. Where they had once respected the wisdom of their elders and the achievements of their predecessors, they began to develop a contempt for what they saw as the timid limitations of more conventional practitioners. Most significant of all was their gradual shift in fundamental philosophy regarding the relationship between individual will and cosmic law. The ancient wisdom traditions had always taught that true power came from learning to harmonize personal desires with the greater patterns that governed existence. But the interlopers began to believe that sufficiently advanced understanding could allow them to impose their will directly upon reality without regard for such traditional constraints. This philosophical transformation was accompanied by increasingly ambitious magical experiments that pushed the boundaries of what had previously been considered safe or ethical practice. They began to work with forces that earlier generations had deemed too dangerous to manipulate, energies that carried within them the potential for both incredible creation and devastating destruction, depending on how they were channeled and controlled. Their most fateful discovery was a series of ancient texts that spoke of a realm beyond the physical world where ultimate power was said to reside, a sacred space that the golden goddesses themselves had established as a repository for forces too potent to exist safely within the normal boundaries of creation. These writings described the sacred realm, though they did not refer to it by that name, and hinted at the existence of the Triforce without revealing the full truth about its nature or the conditions required for its safe utilization. The interlopers became obsessed with gaining access to this legendary realm, convinced that they had developed sufficient understanding and spiritual discipline to claim whatever powers they might find there without being corrupted or destroyed by them. They devoted years to researching methods for opening gateways between dimensions, experimenting with combinations of shadow magic and dimensional manipulation that had never been attempted before. Their breakthrough, when it finally came, was both a triumph of theoretical understanding and the beginning of their final descent into corruption and madness. Through techniques that combined their mastery of shadow magic with artifacts they had gathered from ruins across the known world, they succeeded in creating a permanent portal to the sacred realm, a stable gateway that would allow them to enter the domain of ultimate power without the divine approval that was supposed to be required for such access. The first expeditions into the sacred realm confirmed their wildest theories about the nature of divine power and the possibilities for mortal transcendence. They found a landscape that seemed to exist according to principles that transcended normal physical law, where thought could become reality and will could reshape the fundamental structure of existence. More importantly, they discovered clear evidence that the legendary Triforce was indeed real and present in this realm, though its exact location and the methods required to claim it remained frustratingly elusive. What the interlopers failed to understand, in their arrogance and ambition, was that their unauthorized presence in the sacred realm was gradually corrupting not only themselves but also the very space they had invaded. The sacred energies that existed in this dimension were not meant to be exposed to minds that lacked the perfect balance and spiritual purity required for safe interaction with ultimate power. Their touch began to poison the realm itself, introducing discordant vibrations that disrupted the harmonious patterns that had maintained cosmic balance since the beginning of creation. As they continued their explorations and experiments, the interlopers found themselves changing in ways that went far beyond the physical transformations they had already experienced. Their magic became increasingly dark and malevolent, powered by energies that seemed to draw strength from suffering and destruction rather than the natural forces that had characterized their earlier practice. Their ability to manipulate shadow expanded into techniques for creating zones of absolute darkness that could drain the life from anything they encompassed. Most disturbing of all was their development of powers that allowed them to influence and corrupt other beings, spreading their philosophical poison like a spiritual plague that could transform the most virtuous individuals into servants of their twisted vision. They discovered that they could create followers not through persuasion or coercion, but through direct manipulation of consciousness itself, rewriting the fundamental beliefs and desires that defined personality and moral character. The interlopers' corruption of the sacred realm began to have effects that extended far beyond their immediate presence, creating ripples of disturbance that affected the balance of forces throughout the physical world. Natural disasters became more frequent and severe, while the boundaries between different planes of existence began to weaken in ways that allowed dangerous entities to slip through cracks in reality. More subtle but equally troubling were the effects on the spiritual health of ordinary people throughout the kingdom. Individuals who had never been exposed to shadow magic or dimensional manipulation began to experience nightmares and visions that seemed to come from external sources rather than their own subconscious minds. Communities that had lived in harmony for generations found themselves torn by conflicts that arose from seemingly nowhere, as if some malevolent influence was deliberately sowing discord and mistrust. The light spirits, those divine guardians that had been established by the golden goddesses to watch over the physical world and maintain cosmic balance, were among the first to recognize the true scope of the threat that the interlopers represented. These ancient beings existed primarily in spiritual rather than physical form, making them sensitive to the kinds of dimensional disturbances that the dark tribe's activities were creating throughout the fabric of reality. From their various domains scattered across the kingdom, the light spirits began to observe and document the growing corruption, using their divine perception to trace the source of the disturbances back to the unauthorized activities taking place within the sacred realm. What they discovered filled even their immortal consciousness with a dread that transcended ordinary fear and approached the realm of cosmic horror. The interlopers were not simply stealing power or knowledge from the sacred realm, but were actively corrupting the fundamental forces that maintained the stability of all existence. Their presence was like an infection that spread through the very fabric of reality, introducing elements of chaos and malevolence into systems that had been designed to operate according to principles of harmony and balance. Worse still, the light spirits realized that the corruption was not random or accidental, but was following patterns that suggested deliberate intent to undermine the cosmic order that the golden goddesses had established. The interlopers had not stumbled into corruption through ignorance or accident, but had embraced it as a tool for achieving their ultimate goal of usurping divine authority and imposing their own will upon the entire structure of creation. The light spirits faced a dilemma that had no precedent in all their long ages of guardianship. They were powerful beings with abilities that far exceeded those of any mortal creatures, but their authority was limited to maintaining balance rather than actively intervening in the choices that free-willed beings made for themselves. The cosmic laws that governed their existence prevented them from simply destroying the interlopers or forcing them to abandon their corrupted path. Yet the threat that the Dark Tribe represented was so fundamental and far-reaching that it seemed to justify extraordinary measures, even if such actions pushed the boundaries of what divine guardians were normally permitted to undertake. The corruption of the sacred realm threatened not just the kingdom of Hyrule or even the physical world, but the entire structure of ordered existence that connected all planes of reality in harmonious relationship. After consultation among themselves and careful consideration of alternatives that might resolve the crisis without requiring such extreme intervention, the light spirits made the unprecedented decision to create an entirely new plane of existence that could serve as a prison for beings whose corruption had made them fundamentally incompatible with the normal order of creation. This would not be a realm of punishment in any conventional sense, but rather a space where the interlopers could exist without continuing to spread their poison throughout the cosmos. The construction of what would eventually become known as the Twilight Realm represented one of the greatest workings of divine magic that had been attempted since the original creation of the world. It required the light spirits to pour vast amounts of their own essence into the project, permanently diminishing their individual power in order to create a stable, dimensional space that could contain beings of such concentrated malevolence. The realm they created was neither entirely light nor entirely dark, but rather existed in a state of eternal twilight that reflected both the corrupted nature of its intended inhabitants and the hope that even the most fallen beings might eventually find redemption if given sufficient time and opportunity for reflection. It was a place of strange beauty, where geometric patterns of light and shadow created landscapes that seemed to exist at the boundary between dream and reality. The process of actually banishing the interlopers to this newly created realm required a confrontation that took place simultaneously on multiple planes of existence, as the light spirits had to overcome not only the Dark Tribe's formidable magical abilities, but also their intimate knowledge of dimensional manipulation techniques that they had developed through their years of unauthorized exploration. The war that followed was unlike any conflict that had previously occurred in the history of the world, as it was fought not with conventional weapons or even ordinary magic, but through direct manipulation of the fundamental forces that determined the nature of reality itself. Battles took place in spaces that existed between dimensions, where the normal rules of physics held no meaning and victory was determined by the purity of intention rather than the application of superior force. The interlopers fought with desperate fury, using every technique and artifact they had acquired during their long descent into corruption. They summoned creatures from nightmare dimensions, created zones of absolute darkness that could consume matter and energy alike, and attempted to turn the light spirit's own divine nature against them by introducing elements of doubt and despair into their consciousness. Yet for all their power and cunning, the interlopers ultimately discovered that corruption contained within it the seeds of its own defeat. Their abilities, impressive as they were, drew upon sources of energy that were fundamentally destructive and therefore limited in their capacity for sustained operation. They could create tremendous amounts of damage in short periods, but they could not maintain their efforts indefinitely without consuming themselves in the process. The light spirits, by contrast, drew their power from sources that were generative and self-renewing, allowing them to maintain their resistance even when the immediate situation seemed hopeless. Their commitment to protecting the cosmic order gave them access to reserves of strength that transcended their individual capabilities, while their harmony with divine will allowed them to channel forces that the interlopers could not even perceive, much less counter. The decisive moment of the conflict came when the light spirits managed to establish a direct connection between the sacred realm and the newly created twilight realm, creating a metaphysical suction that began to draw the corruption out of the sacred space and into the dimensional prison that had been prepared for it. The interlopers found themselves pulled inexorably toward banishment. Their own mastery of shadow magic turned against them as the darkness they had embraced became the instrument of their exile. The transformation that occurred as they were drawn into the twilight realm was both punishment and mercy, as the dimensional transition changed their fundamental nature in ways that removed their ability to spread corruption while preserving their consciousness and the possibility for eventual redemption. They became the Twili, shadow beings who retained their intelligence and memories but could no longer exist safely in the realm of light. This transformation was not merely physical but spiritual, as the Twilight Realm's unique properties gradually began to heal the corruption that had accumulated within their souls across the long years of their descent into darkness. The process would take millennia to complete, and many of the exiled interlopers would never fully recover from the choices they had made, but the possibility for redemption remained open for those who could learn to embrace humility and service rather than ambition and domination. The banishment of the interlopers and their transformation into the Twili marked the end of the greatest threat to cosmic stability that had arisen since the original defeat of Demise, but it also established precedents and created conditions that would influence the development of future conflicts across the ages. The existence of the Twilight Realm introduced a new element into the cosmic balance, a space that existed at the boundary between light and dark, and could serve as either sanctuary or staging ground, depending on the intentions of those who accessed it. More significantly, the techniques and knowledge that the interlopers had developed during their corruption were not entirely lost, but remained accessible to future generations who might be tempted to follow similar paths. The artifacts they had gathered, the dimensional manipulation techniques they had mastered, and the philosophical frameworks that had justified their actions all survived in various forms, waiting to influence individuals who might possess the ambition but lack the wisdom to use such power responsibly. The light spirits, weakened by their great working but vindicated in their decision to take extraordinary action, returned to their normal duties of maintaining cosmic balance with a deeper understanding of both the fragility and the resilience of the ordered world they served to protect. They had learned that even divine authority had its limitations, that some threats required responses that pushed the boundaries of acceptable intervention, and that the price of preserving cosmic harmony sometimes included difficult choices that would have consequences extending across multiple generations. The kingdom that emerged from this cosmic crisis was subtly but permanently changed, marked by the knowledge that ambitious mortals could indeed threaten the very foundations of existence if their hunger for power was allowed to develop without proper guidance and restraint. This understanding would influence the development of future magical traditions, educational systems, and governmental policies in ways that emphasized the importance of wisdom and humility over pure ability or achievement. Yet the ultimate legacy of the Interloper War was not fear or restriction, but rather a deeper appreciation for the precious nature of the balanced world that the Golden Goddesses had created. The near loss of cosmic harmony had demonstrated both how fragile such balance could be and how powerful the forces were that arose to defend it when threatened. The Light Spirit's intervention proved that divine wisdom included not just the patience to allow mortals to make their own choices, but also the courage to act decisively when those choices threatened the well-being of all creation. In the Twilight Realm, the transformed interlopers began their long journey toward understanding the true nature of power and its proper relationship to wisdom and compassion. Some would eventually achieve the redemption that the light spirits had made possible, while others would remain trapped in the twilight of their own making, neither fully light nor completely dark, but suspended in the eternal possibility of change. The boundaries between realms had been redrawn. The cosmic balance had been tested and preserved, and the world had gained a deeper understanding of both its vulnerability and its strength. In the shadows cast by twilight, in the spaces between light and dark, the echo of this ancient conflict would continue to resonate through all the ages to come, a reminder that even the darkest corruption could be contained, and that hope could survive even in the deepest places where light seemed unable to penetrate. In the ages that followed the banishment of the interlopers and the establishment of the Twilight Realm as a place of exile and potential redemption, the kingdom of Hyrule entered what would later be remembered as its first true golden age, a period when the diverse peoples of the realm learned to live together in harmony so complete that their cooperation became the foundation for achievements that surpassed anything that any single race could have accomplished in isolation. This was not the artificial peace that comes from the domination of the strong over the weak, nor the fragile tranquility that emerges from mutual exhaustion after devastating conflict, but rather the deep and abiding harmony that arises when different peoples recognize that their differences are not obstacles to overcome, but rather complementary strengths that can be woven together into something far more magnificent than the sum of its individual parts. The transformation of scattered tribal territories into a unified kingdom had not happened overnight, nor had it been accomplished through conquest or coercion, but rather through a gradual process of cultural exchange and mutual recognition that extended across several generations. Each race had contributed something unique and irreplaceable to the growing civilization, while also learning from their neighbors in ways that enriched their own traditions without diminishing their distinctive character. High on the volcanic slopes of Death Mountain, where the earth itself burned with inner fire and the air shimmered with heat that would have been lethal to most living creatures, the Gorons had established their settlements in harmony with forces so primal and dangerous that other peoples could barely comprehend how anyone could not only survive but actually thrive in such an environment. Yet the rock-eating giants who called this infernal landscape home had developed a culture so warm and welcoming that visitors often found it difficult to reconcile the fierce appearance of the mountain dwellers with their gentle and blank genre nature. The Gorons had learned through countless generations to see beauty and opportunity where others perceived only destruction and chaos. They could read the mountain's moods in the subtle changes of geological tension, predict volcanic eruptions through vibrations that their sensitive feet could detect through solid stone, and find precious metals and gems in formations that appeared to outsiders as nothing more than worthless rock. Their relationship with Death Mountain was not one of mere coexistence, but of genuine partnership, as if the mountain itself had chosen to nurture and protect these peculiar beings who alone among all living creatures could appreciate its fierce majesty. The Goron concept of family extended far beyond the biological bonds that defined kinship among other races, encompassing instead a philosophy of brotherhood that could embrace anyone who demonstrated the proper combination of courage, honesty, and loyalty. Visitors to their mountain communities often found themselves adopted into Goron families through simple acts of friendship, while their children grew up considering these massive stone-eating beings to be uncles and aunts whose affection was as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. Their contribution to the growing kingdom extended far beyond the obvious advantages of their mining expertise and metalworking skills, though these practical benefits were certainly significant. The Gorons brought with them a worldview that emphasized cooperation over competition, generosity over accumulation, and patient persistence over quick solutions. Their approach to problem solving involved careful consideration of long-term consequences rather than pursuit of immediate advantage, while their definition of success centered on the well-being of the entire community rather than individual achievement. The metal tools and weapons that emerged from Goron forges were renowned throughout the kingdom, not merely for their superior quality, but for the spirit of craftsmanship that went into their creation. Each blade was shaped not just to serve its immediate function, but to reflect the character and values of both its maker and its intended user. Goron smiths would spend days or even weeks getting to know the person who had commissioned a particular piece, learning about their personality, their goals, and their ethical principles, before beginning the actual forging process. The result of this personalized approach was tools and weapons that seemed to possess their own personality and intelligence, adapting to their users' needs in ways that went beyond mere mechanical efficiency. A Goron-forged sword would balance differently in the hands of a cautious fighter than it would for an aggressive warrior, while their mining tools could guide their users toward hidden veins of valuable ore through subtle variations in weight distribution and resonance. In the crystal-clear waters of Zora's domain, where ancient architecture flowed like frozen music, and every surface reflected light in patterns too beautiful for ordinary language to describe, the aquatic people had developed a civilization that embodied the fluid adaptability and timeless patience that characterized their relationship with the element they had made their home. The Zora possessed lifespans that extended across centuries, giving them perspectives on change and continuity that proved invaluable in the development of stable institutions and long-term planning. Their domain was not merely a collection of buildings constructed near water, but rather an architectural symphony that had been shaped through generations of careful collaboration between Zora designers and the natural forces of erosion, current, and crystalline growth. The walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of flowing water, while chambers were arranged according to acoustic principles that allowed conversations conducted in one room to be heard clearly in distant areas through carefully calculated patterns of reflection and resonance. The Zora's understanding of healing arts surpassed that of any other people in the kingdom, not merely because of their technical knowledge of anatomy and medicine, but because their long lives had taught them to perceive illness and injury as temporary disruptions in patterns that could be restored through patient application of appropriate remedies. They approached healing not as a battle to be won against disease, but as a collaborative effort to help the patient's own vital forces re-establish their natural harmony. Their diplomatic skills proved equally valuable in the development of the kingdom's political institutions, as their extended lifespans allowed them to maintain consistency of policy and relationship across multiple generations of shorter-lived leaders. A Zora diplomat might negotiate treaties with the grandfather, father, and son of a particular highly and noble family, providing continuity and institutional memory that prevented misunderstandings and conflicts from arising due to generational changes in leadership. The Zora's approach to conflict resolution emphasized patience and understanding over force or intimidation, reflecting their belief that most disputes arose from miscommunication or incomplete information, rather than fundamental incompatibility of interests. They would spend months or even years carefully investigating the underlying causes of disagreements, gathering perspectives from all parties involved, and developing solutions that addressed root causes, rather than merely treating symptoms. Their libraries contained the most complete historical records in the kingdom, maintained through centuries of careful scholarship that combined written documentation with oral traditions passed down through family lines that could be traced back to the earliest days of organized civilization. These archives served not merely as repositories of information, but as active resources for understanding patterns and trends that could guide future decision-making. High in the northwestern peaks, where the air grew thin and the winds carried the songs of eternal winter, the Rito had established their settlements in harmony with the sky itself, their architecture rising from rocky outcroppings like natural extensions of the mountain peaks. These proud bird people had mastered not merely the mechanics of flight, but the deeper mysteries of air and weather, developing abilities that allowed them to read atmospheric conditions with accuracy that surpassed any instruments created by ground-bound races. The Rito approach to communication had revolutionized the kingdom's ability to maintain contact across vast distances, as their natural flying abilities combined with their understanding of wind patterns allowed them to establish message networks that could carry information from one end of the realm to the other in a matter of days rather than weeks. Their messengers were trained not merely in navigation and endurance, but in the subtle arts of observation and analysis that allowed them to provide detailed intelligence about conditions throughout the kingdom. Their musical traditions had enriched the cultural life of the entire realm, as Rito composers created works that seemed to capture the very essence of flight and freedom in audible form. Their songs could inspire courage in the faint-hearted, provide comfort to the grieving, and kindle hope in those who had lost faith in the possibility of positive change. Rito musicians were welcomed in every court and community throughout the kingdom, their performances serving as bridges between different cultures and reminders of the beauty that could emerge when diverse traditions were allowed to influence and inspire each other. The Rito's perspective from the sky had also contributed significantly to the kingdom's understanding of geography and climate, as their aerial observations revealed patterns and connections that were invisible from ground level. They could predict weather changes days in advance, identify potential routes for trade and travel, and provide early warning of natural disasters or hostile forces that might threaten the kingdom's security. Their military contributions went far beyond reconnaissance and communication, as Rito warriors had developed aerial combat techniques that made them nearly invincible in their chosen element. They could strike from unexpected angles, retreat to positions that ground-based enemies could not reach, and coordinate attacks across multiple locations simultaneously. Yet their approach to warfare emphasized precision and minimization of casualties rather than overwhelming force, reflecting their understanding that true victory required not just defeating enemies, but creating conditions for lasting peace. In the vast expanses of the Gerudo Desert, where the sun's fire transformed sand into landscapes of ever-shifting beauty, and the nights brought cold that could freeze unprepared travelers, the warrior women of the desert had built a civilization that embodied strength, independence, and fierce loyalty to their chosen family and allies. The Gerudo had learned through countless generations to find abundance in apparent scarcity, to navigate by stars that other peoples could barely see, and to survive in conditions that would have killed less adapted individuals within hours. Their society was built around principles of merit and achievement, rather than birth or inherited privilege, creating a culture where leadership positions were earned through demonstrated competence and unwavering commitment to the welfare of the community. Gerudo chiefs were expected to excel not merely as warriors but as diplomats, strategists, and spiritual guides who could inspire their people to greatness while also maintaining the complex relationships with other nations that kept their desert realm prosperous and secure. The Gerudo understanding of trade and commerce had transformed the kingdom's economic systems, as their extensive caravan networks connected distant regions and diverse peoples in webs of mutual benefit and cultural exchange. They had developed sophisticated methods for evaluating goods and services, establishing fair prices, and maintaining trust between trading partners who might not share common languages or cultural backgrounds. Their mastery of lightning magic was legendary throughout the realm, but their approach to this dangerous art emphasized control and precision rather than raw destructive power. Gerudo lightning dancers could call down storms with pinpoint accuracy, channeling electrical forces in ways that could power machinery, provide illumination, or defend against enemies without causing unnecessary collateral damage. The warrior traditions of the Gerudo had contributed significantly to the kingdom's military capabilities, not merely through their individual fighting skills, but through their understanding of strategy, logistics, and the psychological aspects of conflict. They had developed training methods that created soldiers who were not just physically powerful, but mentally resilient, capable of maintaining discipline and effectiveness even under the most challenging circumstances. Yet perhaps their greatest contribution to the kingdom's development was their example of how a society could maintain its distinctive character while also participating fully in larger cooperative endeavors. The Gerudo had never allowed their alliance with other peoples to diminish their own cultural identity, instead finding ways to share their traditions and values while also learning from their neighbors and allies. At the heart of this great confederation of peoples, serving as the connecting tissue that bound all the diverse races together into a single functioning civilization, were the Hylians, whose adaptability and diplomatic instincts had made them natural mediators and administrators. They possessed no single outstanding characteristic that could match the Goron's strength, the Zora's longevity, the Rito's flight, or the Gerudo's desert mastery, but their very versatility made them invaluable in creating institutions and relationships that could accommodate such diversity. The Hylians had developed forms of government and law that could function effectively across cultural boundaries, creating systems that respected the autonomy of each race, while also providing mechanisms for resolving disputes and coordinating collective action when necessary. Their legal codes were based not on rigid rules imposed from above, but on flexible principles that could be adapted to different situations, while maintaining consistency in their underlying values of fairness, compassion, and respect for individual dignity. Their merchants and traders had established commercial networks that connected every region of the kingdom, creating economic relationships that made cooperation more profitable than conflict, while also ensuring that resources and goods could be distributed according to need, rather than merely local availability. Hylian trading posts became centers of cultural exchange where ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions could cross racial boundaries and inspire new forms of creative expression. The Hylian approach to education emphasized not just the acquisition of knowledge, but the development of wisdom and character, creating schools and academies that welcomed students from all races and backgrounds. These institutions served as laboratories for developing new approaches to cooperation and understanding, as young people from different cultures learned to work together on common projects, while also gaining appreciation for the unique perspectives and abilities that each tradition contributed to the whole. In the great castle town that grew up around the royal seat of power, the success of this multicultural experiment became visible in the daily interactions between citizens whose ancestors had once viewed each other as strangers or potential enemies. Goron smiths worked alongside Hylian jewelers to create ornaments that combined technical excellence with artistic beauty. Zora scholars collaborated with Rito observers to develop new understanding of weather patterns and climate cycles. Gerudo merchants partnered with traders from all races to establish routes and relationships that brought prosperity to every corner of the kingdom. The festivals and celebrations that marked the turning of seasons and the commemoration of historical events became expressions of unity and diversity, as each race contributed its own traditions and customs to create observances that belonged fully to everyone, while losing nothing of their distinctive character. Music, dance, cuisine, and craftsmanship from all cultures blended together in ways that created entirely new forms of artistic expression, while also honoring their individual sources. The royal court itself became a symbol of successful cooperation, with advisors and officials drawn from every race according to their expertise and wisdom, rather than their ethnic background. The Hylian royal family had learned that true leadership required not imposing a single vision upon diverse peoples, but rather creating conditions where all could contribute their best while working toward common goals. This golden age of harmony and cooperation produced technological and artistic achievements that surpassed anything that any individual race could have accomplished in isolation. Architectural projects combined Goron engineering skills with Zora understanding of fluid dynamics, Rito mastery of aerial perspective, and Gerudo expertise in desert construction techniques, creating buildings that seemed to embody the very spirit of successful collaboration. Magical research benefited from the sharing of different approaches and perspectives, as practitioners from various traditions learned to combine their techniques in ways that enhanced rather than diluted their individual effectiveness. The result was innovations in healing, communication, transportation, and defensive magic that provided benefits to the entire kingdom while respecting the cultural context from which they had emerged. The agricultural systems that fed this growing population represented another triumph of cooperative achievement, as farmers learned to adapt techniques from different environments and apply them in new contexts. Goron knowledge of mineral nutrition, combined with Zora understanding of irrigation, Rito insights into weather patterns, and Gerudo expertise in desert cultivation, to create farming methods that could support larger populations while also improving rather than depleting the land. Yet perhaps the greatest achievement of this golden age was not any specific technological or artistic accomplishment, but rather the transformation in consciousness that had occurred among all the participating peoples. They had learned to see diversity not as a problem to be solved, but as a resource to be treasured. Difference not as a barrier to overcome, but as an opportunity for mutual enrichment. The children who grew up during this period took for granted forms of cooperation and understanding that their grandparents would have considered impossible. They spoke multiple languages as naturally as breathing, adapted their behavior and expectations to accommodate different cultural contexts without losing their own identity, and approached problems with the assumption that solutions could be found through collaboration rather than competition. This generation would face challenges that would test everything they had learned about cooperation and mutual support, but they would meet those challenges with advantages that no previous generation had possessed. They had been raised to see strength in unity, wisdom in diversity, and hope in the possibility that different peoples could work together to create something greater than any of them could achieve alone. The Golden Age would not last forever, as no human achievement ever does, but it would leave a legacy that would endure through all the trials and tribulations that lay ahead. The knowledge that such harmony was possible, that different races could indeed live and work together in mutual respect and support, would inspire future generations even during the darkest periods when cooperation seemed impossible and trust had been shattered by betrayal and conflict. In the quiet moments between the great dramas of history, in the small daily interactions between neighbors and colleagues of different backgrounds, in the festivals and celebrations that brought communities together in joy and thanksgiving, the spirit of this golden age continued to live. It survived not as a memory of the past, but as a promise for the future, a reminder that the boundaries between peoples were not walls that divided, but rivers that could be crossed, bridges that connected, and gardens where new forms of beauty could grow from the mingling of different traditions and perspectives. The ancient races had proven that diversity was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated, and that lesson would echo through all the ages to come. deep within the most ancient forests of Hyrule, where the trees grew so tall that their crowns seemed to brush against the very dome of heaven, and their roots reached down into earth so old that it remembered the first words spoken by the golden goddesses themselves. There existed a realm that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those that governed the ordinary world of mortal affairs and political boundaries. This was the domain of the Lost Woods, a place where time moved in spirals rather than straight lines, where direction was determined more by intention than by compass bearings, and where the very concept of growing older had been gently set aside in favor of something far more mysterious and wonderful. Here, under the protective canopy of leaves that filtered sunlight into patterns of gold and emerald that seemed to dance with their own inner life, dwelt a people who had chosen eternal childhood over the burdens and sorrows that came with adult responsibility. The Kokiri, as these forest children were known to the outside world, had not been born in the conventional sense, but rather had emerged from the dreams and wishes of the great Deku tree, that ancient guardian whose massive trunk served as both sanctuary and wise counselor to all who dwelt within his protective influence. Each Kokiri child was a living expression of some aspect of the forest's eternal spirit, embodying qualities like curiosity, wonder, playfulness, or compassion that the great tree had observed and cherished during his long centuries of watching over the woodland realm. They possessed the appearance of human children aged somewhere between 8 and 12 years old, with bright eyes that held depths of innocence that seemed untouched by any of the cynicism or weariness that gradually accumulated in the hearts of those who lived in the world beyond the forest's borders. Their clothing was simple and practical, woven from materials that seemed to grow rather than be manufactured, in shades of green and brown that allowed them to blend seamlessly with their woodland environment when stealth or concealment became necessary. Yet the most remarkable characteristic of the Kokiri was not their eternal youth or their harmony with the natural world, but rather their partnership with beings of such pure magic and benevolent purpose that their very presence seemed to illuminate whatever space they occupied. Each forest child was accompanied by a fairy companion, a creature of living light whose essence was so closely intertwined with their Kokiri partner that the two beings shared thoughts, emotions, and experiences in ways that transcended ordinary friendship or even family bonds. These guardian fairies were not mere pets or magical accessories, but rather fully conscious entities whose wisdom and perspective complemented and enhanced that of their Kokiri companions in ways that created partnerships far greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. Where the forest children brought curiosity, enthusiasm, and an unlimited capacity for joy, the fairies contributed knowledge, foresight, and a deeper understanding of the magical currents that flowed through the forest, like invisible rivers of power and meaning. The fairies appeared as points of colored light that pulsed with gentle radiance, their luminescence shifting through spectrums that corresponded to their emotional states and the nature of their communications. When excited or happy, they might glow with warm golden light that seemed to capture the essence of summer sunshine, while moments of concern or warning would manifest as cooler, blue or silver radiance that carried undertones of urgency without ever becoming harsh or frightening. Their voices, when they chose to speak rather than communicate through the empathic bonds they shared with their partners, carried tones like tiny silver bells or the whisper of wind through autumn leaves, conveying meaning not just through words but through harmonics and resonances that could touch the heart directly without needing to pass through the analytical functions of the conscious mind. A fairy's laughter could heal minor injuries and lift spirits that had been dampened by temporary setbacks, while their songs could guide lost travelers to safety or inspire courage in those who faced challenges that seemed beyond their ability to overcome. The relationship between Kokiri and fairy was established not through choice or assignment, but through a form of spiritual resonance that occurred when compatible essences recognized each other. Across the boundaries that normally separated different forms of consciousness, when a new Kokiri child emerged from the dreams of the great Deku tree, they would wander through the forest in a state of innocent exploration until they encountered the fairy whose nature harmonized perfectly with their own emerging personality and purpose. This moment of recognition and bonding was one of the most sacred events in the forest community, celebrated by all who witnessed it as evidence of the continuing vitality and harmony of their woodland realm. The newly paired companions would spend their first days together in joyous exploration of their shared consciousness, learning to communicate without words, to share experiences across the boundaries of individual perception, and to support each other through the gentle challenges and discoveries that characterized life in their protected paradise. The village where the Kokiri made their communal home was not built in the conventional sense, but rather had grown organically from the forest itself, with dwellings that seemed to be living trees that had been persuaded to shape themselves into comfortable habitations. The walls breathed with the rhythm of growing wood. The roofs were formed from interwoven branches that provided perfect protection from rain, while allowing gentle breezes to circulate freely, and the floors were carpeted with moss so soft and resilient that walking upon it felt like floating on clouds of green silk. Each dwelling was unique, shaped according to the personality and preferences of its Kokiri inhabitant, but all shared certain characteristics that reflected the communal values and spiritual principles that governed forest society. There were no locks on doors, because the concept of theft was unknown among beings who shared everything freely and joyously. There were no walls between neighboring homes because privacy was understood to be a temporary need rather than a permanent boundary, and the forest children delighted in spontaneous visits and impromptu gatherings that could transform an ordinary afternoon into a celebration. The great Deku tree himself served as both the physical and spiritual center of their community, his massive trunk rising from the earth like a natural cathedral, whose interior spaces provided meeting halls, libraries, meditation chambers, and sleeping quarters for those who sought the deepest communion with the forest's ancient wisdom. His branches, some of which were thicker than the largest buildings in human cities, supported platforms and walkways that connected different levels of the forest canopy in a three-dimensional transportation network that made every corner of their woodland realm easily accessible. The tree's voice, when he chose to speak aloud rather than communicate through the subtle influences and intuitive guidance that characterized most of his interactions with his forest children, carried the weight and wisdom of countless centuries, each word chosen with care and delivered with the kind of paternal affection that could make even the most troubled heart feel safe and cherished. His advice was sought not just by the Kokiri, but by visitors from the outside world who had somehow found their way through the maze-like paths that protected the forest's innermost secrets from those who lacked the pure intention necessary to reach its heart. Yet the great Deku tree's most important function was not as advisor or protector, but rather as guardian of one of the most sacred and powerful artifacts in the entire world, a responsibility that he had accepted with full knowledge that it would define and limit his existence for as long as the forces of darkness continued to threaten the balance between light and shadow that maintained cosmic order. Deep within his trunk, in a chamber that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual realms, rested the Master Sword, that legendary blade which had been forged in the earliest days of creation as the ultimate weapon against the forces of entropy and malevolence. The sword was not merely a tool, but a living expression of divine will, possessing its own consciousness and intelligence that could judge the worthiness of any who sought to claim it as their weapon in the eternal struggle against evil. The Master Sword's presence in the forest created effects that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the Great Deku Tree, establishing the entire woodland realm as a sanctuary where the forces of corruption and malice could not gain purchase. This protective influence allowed the Kokiri to maintain their innocence and purity, even as the world beyond the forest boundaries was periodically swept by conflicts and catastrophes that tested the moral strength and spiritual resilience of all other peoples. The blade slumbered in its sacred resting place, waiting with the patience that only divine artifacts could possess for the arrival of the hero who would be worthy to wield it in the battles that lay ahead. Yet its dormancy was not complete inactivity, as the sword's spiritual essence continued to watch and evaluate, using senses that transcended physical perception to monitor the spiritual development of individuals throughout the kingdom who might someday prove worthy of its partnership. The criteria by which the Master Sword judged potential wielders were far more complex and demanding than simple courage or fighting ability, though both of these qualities were certainly necessary. The blade sought a heart that had achieved perfect balance between strength and compassion, wisdom and action, determination and humility. Most importantly, it required a soul that could wield ultimate power without being corrupted by it. Someone who would always remember that true strength came from the desire to protect others rather than to dominate them. The forest children served as the sword's guardians, not through martial prowess or magical defenses, though they possessed their own forms of protection when circumstances required them, but rather through their embodiment of the very qualities that the blade was designed to defend. Their innocence and joy represented everything that was worth preserving in the world, while their harmony with the natural order demonstrated the kind of balance and integration that the sword's eventual wielder would need to achieve. Yet, the Kokiri's role as guardians extended beyond simply maintaining the Master Sword's resting place, as they had also been entrusted with preserving knowledge and traditions that would be needed when the time came for the blade to be drawn from its sanctuary. They maintained libraries of ancient lore written in scripts that predated any human civilization, preserved rituals and ceremonies that could cleanse corruption and restore spiritual balance, and practiced forms of magic that could heal not just physical injuries, but the deeper wounds that evil could inflict upon the soul itself. Their magical abilities were not the flashy and dramatic forms of power that characterized combat magic or the impressive displays that marked ceremonial occasions, but rather the subtle and profound influences that could encourage growth, inspire hope, and maintain the delicate balances that allowed life to flourish in all its myriad forms. A Kokiri could encourage a withered plant to bloom again, with nothing more than a gentle touch and a whispered word of encouragement, guide lost travelers to safety through forest paths that seemed to rearrange themselves according to need rather than fixed geography, or heal emotional trauma through songs that carried the power to transform pain into wisdom. The fairies who accompanied each forest child possessed their own forms of magical ability that complemented and enhanced those of their partners, creating collaborative effects that neither could achieve independently. Where Kokiri magic worked through empathy and emotional resonance, fairy magic operated through manipulation of the fundamental forces that governed probability and causation, allowing them to create what outsiders might perceive as miraculous coincidences or impossibly fortunate accidents. Together, Kokiri and Fairy could create pockets of enhanced luck and favorable circumstance that extended protection, not just to themselves, but to anyone they chose to aid, ensuring that good fortune would follow the deserving, while obstacles would arise to impede those who approached the forest with malicious intent. These effects were so subtle and natural seeming that even those who benefited from them often remained unaware that they had received supernatural assistance. attributing their good fortune to natural causes or their own wisdom and skill. The forest itself responded to the combined influence of its inhabitants and guardians, developing characteristics that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between conscious will and natural process. Trees would rearrange their growth patterns to create comfortable resting places for tired travelers. Streams would alter their courses to provide fresh water where it was most needed, and paths would appear or disappear according to the intentions and worthiness of those who sought to traverse them. This responsiveness of the physical environment to spiritual and emotional influences created a realm where the boundary between inner and outer experience became fluid and permeable, where thoughts and feelings could manifest as external phenomena with a directness that would have been impossible in more mundane environments. The forest became a living expression of the consciousness of those who dwelt within it, reflecting their collective mood and responding to their needs with the devotion of a beloved family member. Yet this paradise of eternal childhood was not without its own forms of challenge and growth, as the Kokiri faced tests and trials that were appropriate to their nature and circumstances, even if they differed dramatically from those that confronted inhabitants of the outside world. Their challenges were not wars or political conflicts, famines or natural disasters, but rather the subtle difficulties that arose from learning to live in perfect harmony with others while maintaining individual identity and purpose. Each Kokiri child was unique, possessing their own personality, interests, and talents that contributed something distinctive to the forest community, but they also had to learn to balance personal expression with collective responsibility in ways that honored both individual creativity and social harmony. Their conflicts, when they arose, were resolved not through force or authority, but through patient dialogue and mutual understanding that sought solutions benefiting all parties involved. The educational system that prepared young Kokiri for their roles as forest guardians was based not on formal instruction or rigid curricula, but on experiential learning that allowed each child to discover their own path toward wisdom, maturity. They learned through play and exploration, through observation of natural processes, and through gentle guidance from older community members who had faced similar challenges in their own development. Their games were not mere entertainment, but rather sophisticated training exercises that developed the skills and understanding they would need as they grew into their roles as protectors of forest wisdom and guardians of sacred knowledge. A game of hide and seek might teach lessons about stealth and observation that could be applied to more serious situations, while collaborative building projects using natural materials provided instruction in cooperation, planning, and the manipulation of magical forces. The fairy companions who partnered with each child served as both playmates and tutors, their broader perspective and deeper knowledge providing guidance that helped young Kokiri navigate the complexities of their development without losing the spontaneity and joy that made childhood magical. The fairies could perceive potential problems before they became serious difficulties, offer alternative perspectives when situations seemed impossible, and provide the kind of unconditional emotional support that allowed their partners to take risks and learn from mistakes without fear of judgment or rejection. As the centuries passed and the outside world experienced the cycles of growth and decline, conflict and peace, innovation and tradition that characterized mortal civilizations, the forest realm maintained its timeless quality, while also adapting to changing circumstances in ways so subtle that even its inhabitants often remained unaware of the gradual transformations that were taking place within their community. The Kokiri themselves began to change, their forms slowly evolving from humanoid to something more plant-like as they became ever more deeply integrated with the forest environment that had always been their home. This transformation was not imposed upon them by external forces, but rather represented the natural result of their growing harmony with the woodland realm and their increasing identification with the eternal cycles of growth and renewal that governed all plant life. They became the Koroks, small beings who resembled animated plants more than human children, their faces emerging from wooden masks that seemed to grow rather than be crafted, their bodies covered in leaves and bark that changed with the seasons, just as the trees around them transformed their appearance in response to the turning of the year. Yet this physical metamorphosis represented not a loss of their essential nature, but rather its fullest expression, as they had finally achieved the complete integration with their environment that had always been their deepest aspiration. The Koroks retained all the joy, wisdom, and magical abilities that had characterized their existence as Kokiri, while gaining new capabilities that reflected their transformed nature and expanded understanding of their role as guardians of forest wisdom. They could remain motionless for years at a time when circumstances required it, blending so perfectly with the trees around them that even the most observant visitors would pass them by without recognition. Yet they could also travel vast distances through underground route networks, or by allowing themselves to be carried by winds that responded to their will and intention. Their games became even more sophisticated and meaningful, incorporating elements that spanned decades or centuries and involved cooperation with forces and entities from throughout the natural world. A single Korok game might involve the careful cultivation of specific plant species across multiple forest regions, the establishment of migration routes for particular animal populations, or the creation of seasonal weather patterns that would benefit the entire ecosystem over periods measured in geological rather than human timescales. The fairy companions who had partnered with them as Kokiri children adapted to their new forms and expanded consciousness, their own nature evolving in response to the changes in their beloved partners, while maintaining the essential bonds of affection and mutual support that had always defined their relationships. The fairies gained new abilities that complemented those of the Koroks, developing techniques for communicating across vast distances, manipulating probability streams over extended periods, and coordinating complex magical workings that involved multiple participants and overlapping effects. Together, Koroks and fairies maintained their role as guardians of the Master Sword and protectors of the ancient wisdom that would someday be needed when heroes arose to face the eternal return of darkness and chaos. They preserved not just information and artifacts, but the living understanding that gave meaning to knowledge, ensuring that future generations would have access not merely to facts and techniques, but to the wisdom and spiritual insight necessary to use such knowledge responsibly. Their forest realm became a network of hidden sanctuaries scattered throughout the kingdom, connected by paths that existed as much in spiritual as physical dimensions, and accessible to those who possessed the pure intention and noble purpose necessary to perceive them. From these concealed outposts, the Koroks worked quietly and patiently to maintain the balance between civilization and wildness, ensuring that the advancing tide of mortal development did not completely overwhelm the natural world or destroy the delicate ecosystems that supported countless forms of life. The seeds they planted would grow into forests that would shelter future generations. The magic they wove would protect sacred sites from desecration and corruption, and the wisdom they preserved would provide guidance and inspiration for heroes who had not yet been born, but whose coming they anticipated with the serene confidence that came from understanding the eternal patterns that governed the cosmic dance between light and darkness. In the rustling of leaves that seemed to whisper secrets too profound for ordinary language, in the sudden appearance of helpful paths through seemingly impenetrable undergrowth, in the unexpected discoveries of food and shelter that saved lost travelers from disaster, The presence of the Koroks could still be felt by those who possessed the sensitivity to perceive their subtle influences. They remained the eternal children of the forest, guardians of wonder and keepers of hope, ensuring that no matter how dark the world might become, or how desperate the circumstances faced by those who fought against the forces of evil, the light of innocence and joy would continue to shine in hidden places where it could inspire and sustain the courage of those who needed it most. Far beyond the borders of the known world, in realms that existed at the intersection of consciousness and reality, where the boundary between dreams and waking experience became as fluid and permeable as morning mist, there drifted through the highest reaches of the sky a being so ancient and mysterious that even the oldest legends preserved only fragmentary hints about its nature and purpose. This was the windfish, a creature whose very existence challenged conventional understanding of what was possible within the ordered cosmos that the golden goddesses had established, for it was simultaneously divine and mortal, sleeping and awake, real and imaginary, in ways that defied the logical categories through which most beings attempted to comprehend their world. Its form resembled that of a great whale, but one that swam through currents of air and dream rather than water, its massive body suspended in the atmosphere by forces so subtle and complex that they seemed to transcend the normal laws of physics. The windfish's scales were not the ordinary armor of aquatic creatures, but rather crystalline formations that captured and refracted not just light, but also the essential frequencies of consciousness itself, creating aurora-like displays that painted the sky with colors that had no names in any mortal language. Its eyes, when they occasionally opened during the brief moments of partial wakefulness that interrupted its eternal slumber, held depths that seemed to contain entire universes, realms of possibility and imagination that existed only as long as the great being chose to dream them into existence. For countless eons, the windfish had drifted through the upper atmosphere in a state of profound meditation that was simultaneously sleep and the deepest form of spiritual contemplation, its consciousness exploring dimensions of experience that existed beyond the reach of ordinary awareness. In this transcendent state, the boundary between dreamer and dream had dissolved so completely that the windfish's sleeping thoughts had begun to manifest as physical reality, creating spaces and beings that possessed all the substance and validity of anything that existed in the conventional world. The most remarkable of these dream-born creations was Koholint Island, a realm that had crystallized from the windfish's sleeping consciousness, like a pearl forming around a grain of sand in an oyster's shell. This island existed in a pocket dimension that was tethered to the physical world by threads of possibility so delicate that most people could never perceive them. Yet it was as real and substantial as any land that had been shaped by geological processes across millions of years. Koholint Island was a place of impossible beauty and gentle melancholy, where landscapes shifted and changed according to emotional resonances that flowed from the windfish's dreaming mind. Mountains rose and fell like frozen music, their peaks reaching toward skies that displayed colors and cloud formations that obeyed aesthetic principles rather than meteorological laws. Forests grew in patterns that reflected the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony, while rivers flowed in courses that seemed to trace the melodic lines of songs that existed only in the deepest layers of the dreamer's unconscious mind. The island's climate was perpetually mild and pleasant, neither too hot nor too cold, neither too wet nor too dry, but rather perfectly balanced according to the windfish's innate sense of what constituted ideal conditions for contemplation and peaceful existence. Flowers bloomed in all seasons without regard for normal botanical limitations, their colors and fragrances shifting subtly in response to the emotional atmosphere that surrounded them, while fruits ripened according to the needs and desires of those who sought sustenance, rather than following any predictable agricultural schedule. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Koholint Island was not its physical beauty or its transcendence of natural law, but rather the community of beings who had emerged from the windfish's dreams to populate this realm of crystallized consciousness. These inhabitants were not created through any deliberate intention or conscious design, but had rather arisen spontaneously from the depths of the dreaming mind, each one representing some aspect of personality, memory, or aspiration that dwelt within the windfish's cosmic consciousness. There was the owl, a wise and mysterious figure whose knowledge seemed to encompass not just the secrets of the island, but insights into the nature of dreams and reality that transcended ordinary understanding. The owl served as guide and counselor to visitors who found their way to the island, offering cryptic advice and philosophical observations that could illuminate the deepest mysteries of existence for those who possessed the wisdom to interpret them correctly. The shopkeeper was a cheerful and accommodating soul, whose establishment seemed to contain exactly the items that customers needed, regardless of how unusual or specific their requirements might be. His inventory defied logical organization, containing everything from practical tools to mystical artifacts, from simple foods to rare delicacies, all arranged according to principles that made perfect sense within the context of dream logic, even if they seemed chaotic to visitors, accustomed to more conventional forms of commerce. In the village that served as the island's social center, families lived in houses that had been shaped more by emotional associations than architectural principles, their rooms expanding or contracting according to the needs of their occupants, their decorations changing to reflect the moods and memories of those who dwelt within them. The villagers themselves were beings of remarkable depth and complexity, possessing fully developed personalities, relationships, and life histories that seemed as real and meaningful as those of any people who had been born through conventional means. Children played games that followed rules that existed only within the boundaries of the island, their laughter creating ripples of joy that could be felt throughout the entire realm. Adults pursued occupations and hobbies that reflected not just their individual interests but also aspects of the windfish's sleeping consciousness, creating art and music and literature that expressed truths too profound for ordinary language to contain. The island's animals were equally remarkable, displaying intelligence and personality that exceeded anything found in the natural world, while also embodying symbolic meanings that connected them to deeper layers of the dreaming mind. Bears spoke in riddles that contained profound wisdom about the nature of strength and gentleness, while birds sang melodies that could heal emotional wounds and inspire courage in those who faced seemingly impossible challenges. Yet beneath the surface beauty and apparent peace of this dream realm, there stirred forces that embodied the darker aspects of the unconscious mind, shadow elements that had emerged from the same source as the island's more benevolent inhabitants but represented fears, anxieties, and destructive impulses that even the most enlightened consciousness could not entirely eliminate. These manifestations called themselves the nightmares, and their purpose was to ensure that the windfish would never awaken from its eternal sleep, trapping both dreamer and dream in a cycle of unconsciousness that would preserve their existence by preventing the return to waking reality that would necessarily dissolve their world. The nightmares were not evil in any simple sense, for they genuinely loved the island and its inhabitants and sought to protect them from what they perceived as the ultimate threat of non-existence. They understood with terrifying clarity that Koholint Island existed only as long as the windfish continued to dream, and that any awakening would necessarily result in the complete dissolution of everything and everyone they held dear. Yet their protective instincts had become corrupted by fear and desperation, transforming them into guardians who preserved their charges through imprisonment rather than liberation. They had established themselves in key locations throughout the island, using their power to create barriers and obstacles that would prevent anyone from discovering the truth about the realm's nature or accessing the means by which the windfish might be awakened from its cosmic slumber. The nightmare's influence could be felt throughout the island in subtle ways that gradually eroded the peace and harmony that had originally characterized the realm. Conversations between villagers began to carry undertones of anxiety and uncertainty, while the natural beauty of the landscape was marred by areas of shadow and corruption that seemed to resist the healing power of the windfish's benevolent dreams. Most insidiously, the nightmares worked to create a sense of complacency and acceptance among the island's inhabitants, encouraging them to believe that their current existence was not just satisfactory, but actually superior to any alternative they might imagine. They whispered suggestions that the outside world was dangerous and chaotic, that change inevitably brought suffering, and that the wisest course was to remain safely within the boundaries of their dream paradise, regardless of what costs such isolation might impose. The key to the windfish's awakening lay in 8 mystical instruments that had been scattered throughout the island during its formation, each one representing a different aspect of the cosmic song that could bridge the gap between sleeping and waking consciousness. These instruments were not mere musical devices, but rather crystallized expressions of the fundamental harmonies that governed the relationship between mind and reality, tools that could be used to perform the Ballad of the Windfish, a melody so profound and beautiful that it could penetrate even the deepest layers of unconscious slumber. The instruments had been hidden in locations that reflected their individual symbolic meanings and musical qualities, protected by challenges and guardians that tested not just the skill and courage of those who sought them, but also their understanding of the deeper principles that governed the nature of dreams and consciousness. Each instrument could only be claimed by someone who had achieved the appropriate level of spiritual development and philosophical insight, ensuring that the power to awaken the windfish would only be accessible to those who truly understood the implications of such an act. The conch horn rested in a cavern by the sea, its spiraling chambers filled with the echoes of ancient songs that spoke of journeys across vast oceans and the longing for distant shores. To claim this instrument, one had to demonstrate not just musical ability, but also the kind of adventurous spirit that could embrace change and uncertainty as opportunities for growth rather than threats to be avoided. The sea lily's bell chimed with tones so pure and ethereal that they seemed to capture the very essence of innocence and hope, but it could only be obtained by someone who had learned to see beauty in the most humble and overlooked aspects of existence. The bell taught the lesson that true wisdom often resided in simplicity rather than complexity, and that the most profound truths could be expressed through the gentlest means. In a library that contained books written in languages that existed only within the boundaries of dream, the surf guitar awaited a musician who could understand that knowledge and creativity were not separate endeavors, but different aspects of the same fundamental drive toward understanding and expression. The guitar's strings vibrated with frequencies that could unite intellectual comprehension with emotional resonance, creating music that spoke directly to both mind and heart. The organ of evening calm required a player who had learned to find peace within chaos and harmony within discord, for its keys could only be properly pressed by fingers that had achieved the kind of inner balance that allowed one to remain centered regardless of external circumstances. The organ's music could soothe the most troubled spirits and bring rest to minds that had forgotten how to find stillness within themselves. Deep within a temple dedicated to the mysteries of memory and forgetting, the triangle rested in silence until touched by someone who understood that the simplest truths were often the most difficult to grasp, and that profound wisdom could be contained within the most basic forms. The triangle's pure note could cut through illusion and reveal reality, but only when struck by hands that had released all attachment to complex explanations and elaborate theories. The tuba of thunder demanded a player whose breath control and physical strength were matched by emotional depth and spiritual power, for its deep tones could shake the very foundations of existence, while also providing the bass notes that gave structure and stability to more delicate melodies. The tuba taught that true strength came not from domination, but from the ability to support and uplift others. In a chamber filled with mirrors that reflected not just physical appearance, but also the hidden aspects of personality and character, the flute of awakening waited for someone who had achieved perfect honesty about their own nature and could play its piercing notes without flinching from the truths they revealed. The flute's music could awaken consciousness at its deepest levels, but it required a player who had already awakened to their own authentic self. Finally, the ocarina of wind could only be claimed by someone who understood that music was not just entertainment or artistic expression, but a fundamental force that connected all aspects of existence in patterns of meaning and beauty that transcended individual understanding. The ocarina's melodies could carry messages across dimensional boundaries and touch the hearts of beings who existed in entirely different planes of reality. When all 8 instruments were gathered together and played in the proper sequence by someone who truly understood their significance, they would produce the Ballad of the Windfish, a musical composition so beautiful and profound that it could penetrate the deepest layers of unconscious slumber and call even the most reluctant dreamer back to waking awareness. Yet the melody carried within it a tragedy so poignant that few who heard it could remain unmoved, for it spoke not just of awakening, but of the inevitable loss that such awakening would bring to all who existed only within the boundaries of dream. The performance of the ballad would necessarily result in the dissolution of Koholint Island and the end of existence for all its inhabitants, yet it would also free the Windfish from the prison of eternal sleep and allow the great being to return to the cosmic duties that it had abandoned in favor of peaceful unconsciousness. The choice between preservation of dream and acceptance of awakening represented one of the most profound moral dilemmas possible, for it required weighing the value of conscious truth against the happiness of beings who existed only as long as that truth remained hidden. The inhabitants of the island, when they finally learned the truth about their nature and the price of their continued existence, displayed the kind of noble acceptance and selfless courage that demonstrated the best aspects of the consciousness that had dreamed them into being. Rather than demanding preservation at any cost, they chose to embrace the reality of their situation and support the awakening that would end their world, but restore the Windfish to its proper place in the cosmic order. Their farewell was not bitter or resentful, but filled with gratitude for the time they had been given and understanding of the role they had played in the great being's period of rest and healing. They had served as companions and teachers, guides and guardians, helping the Windfish process experiences and emotions that were too vast and complex to be handled through direct conscious awareness. The moment of awakening, when it finally came, was both heartbreaking and transcendent, as the island began to fade like morning mist while the Windfish slowly stirred from its eons of slumber. The great being's eyes opened for the first time in millennia, revealing depths of wisdom and compassion that had been enriched and deepened by the dream experience in ways that would influence all its future existence. As Koholint Island dissolved back into the pure consciousness from which it had emerged, its inhabitants maintained their dignity and grace until the very end, their final words expressing not fear or regret, but love and appreciation for the mysterious adventure they had shared. They had learned that existence, even temporary existence, was a gift to be treasured rather than a burden to be endured, and that the meaning of life came not from its duration, but from the love and growth that it made possible. The windfish, now fully awake and aware, carried within its consciousness all the memories and experiences that had occurred during its long dream, preserving the essence of every being that had existed on Koholint Island, and ensuring that their contributions to its understanding would not be lost. They lived on not as separate individuals, but as integrated aspects of the great being's expanded awareness, their personalities and perspectives having become permanent parts of its cosmic consciousness. The awakening marked not an ending but a transformation, as the windfish resumed its journey through the highest reaches of the atmosphere, with new understanding of the relationship between consciousness and reality, dream and waking awareness, individual existence and cosmic unity. Its song, when it chose to sing, now carried harmonies that reflected the wisdom gained through dream experience, melodies that could inspire hope in the darkest moments and remind all who heard them that even the most temporary forms of existence possessed meaning and value that transcended their apparent limitations. In the empty space where Koholint Island had once floated, sensitive souls could sometimes detect echoes of the beautiful realm that had briefly existed there, whispers of laughter and music that served as reminders that dreams, even when they ended, could leave traces of their beauty in the waking world. The windfish's experience had demonstrated that the boundaries between real and imaginary were far more fluid than most beings realized, and that love and consciousness could create forms of existence that were valid and meaningful, regardless of their ultimate permanence. The great being continued its eternal flight through realms that existed beyond ordinary perception, carrying within itself the gifts of dream and the wisdom of awakening, a living symbol of the truth that consciousness could transcend any limitation, and that love could create beauty even in the face of inevitable loss. In the ages when the kingdom of Hyrule had grown from a collection of allied settlements into a truly unified realm where diverse peoples worked together in harmony and mutual respect, when the ancient conflicts between races had given way to cooperation and shared purpose, there arose among the wisest and most spiritually developed individuals of each generation an understanding that their growing civilization would require forms of guidance and protection that transcended the capabilities of ordinary mortal leadership. The challenges facing a kingdom that sought to maintain justice and prosperity across vast distances and among populations with fundamentally different needs and perspectives demanded solutions that drew upon wisdom deeper than political experience or military might could provide. The rulers and administrators who governed through conventional means, no matter how well-intentioned or skillful they might be, operated within limitations imposed by finite lifespans, personal perspectives, and the inevitable biases that shaped all mortal judgment. There were forces at work in the world that operated according to principles and timescales that exceeded ordinary human comprehension, cosmic patterns that manifested across centuries or millennia, and could only be properly understood by consciousness that had transcended the normal boundaries of individual existence. The ancient evil that had been defeated but not destroyed, the gradual accumulation of spiritual corruption that could poison entire civilizations, the slow drift toward imbalance that could destabilize the fundamental forces upon which all life depended. These were threats that required vigilance and wisdom of a kind that no single person or conventional institution could hope to provide. The solution that emerged from careful contemplation and divine inspiration was the establishment of a sacred order whose members would voluntarily sacrifice the normal pleasures and limitations of ordinary life in order to serve as bridges between the mortal and divine realms. These individuals, who would come to be known as the ancient sages, took upon themselves the responsibility of maintaining spiritual balance and providing guidance that could span generations while remaining consistent with the deepest principles of cosmic harmony. The path to becoming a sage was not one that could be chosen lightly or pursued through ambition or desire for power, for it required a complete transformation of consciousness that few individuals possessed the spiritual strength and moral purity to achieve. Candidates emerged naturally from among those whose dedication to serving others had already led them to abandon personal desires in favor of collective well-being. Individuals whose wisdom and compassion had been tested through years of selfless service and whose understanding of cosmic principles had developed through direct spiritual experience rather than mere intellectual study. The first requirement for sagehood was the achievement of perfect balance between all aspects of personality and motivation, a harmonization of opposing forces that allowed the individual to transcend the conflicts and contradictions that normally limited mortal understanding. This balance was not the static equilibrium of forces held in check, but rather the dynamic harmony of elements working together in perfect coordination. Like musicians in an orchestra whose different instruments created beauty through their integration rather than their similarity. A potential sage had to demonstrate mastery over not just their external circumstances, but also their internal landscape of emotions, desires, and fears, achieving a state of inner peace that remained unshaken, regardless of whatever challenges or temptations they might encounter. They needed to prove that their judgment could remain clear and fair, even when they faced situations that threatened their own interests or challenged their deepest convictions, and that their compassion could extend equally to friends and enemies, the deserving and the unworthy, the grateful and the hostile. The transformation process itself took place within sacred temples that had been constructed according to principles that combined the most advanced understanding of both architecture and spiritual science, creating spaces where the boundary between physical and metaphysical reality became permeable enough to allow for the kind of consciousness expansion that sagehood required. These temples were not merely buildings, but rather three-dimensional mandalas that embodied cosmic principles in stone and crystal, their every detail designed to facilitate the profound inner work that candidates needed to undertake. Each temple was dedicated to one of the fundamental forces that governed existence, providing a focus for the specialized knowledge and responsibilities that different sages would need to master in order to fulfill their roles as guardians of cosmic balance. The temples themselves became sources of power and wisdom that could be drawn upon by future generations, repositories of accumulated understanding that would remain available even if the original sages who had established them passed beyond the normal boundaries of mortal existence. The forest temple stood at the heart of an ancient grove where the trees had grown for so many centuries that they seemed to embody the very essence of life and growth in its purest form. Here, surrounded by the gentle rustle of leaves that whispered secrets older than civilization, candidates learned to commune with the fundamental force that drove all living things toward greater complexity and beauty. The forest sage who emerged from this temple became the guardian of life energy itself, responsible for maintaining the delicate balances that allowed ecosystems to flourish, and ensuring that the drive toward growth and change never overwhelmed the stability that made sustained development possible. The lessons taught within the forest temple emphasized patience and persistence, the understanding that true achievement came through gradual development rather than dramatic transformation, and the recognition that every living thing possessed inherent value, regardless of its apparent utility or significance. Candidates learned to perceive the hidden connections that linked all forms of life in webs of mutual dependence and support, developing the ability to strengthen these connections when they were threatened by disease, corruption, or the destructive influences that periodically swept through the natural world. The forest sage's powers manifested as an enhanced ability to encourage healing and growth in all its forms. From the physical regeneration of damaged tissue to the emotional recovery from trauma and loss, from the restoration of damaged ecosystems to the renewal of hope in communities that had been devastated by conflict or natural disaster. Yet these abilities came with the responsibility of understanding when growth should be encouraged and when it needed to be limited, when healing required gentle encouragement and when it demanded more radical intervention. Within the fire temple, built into the heart of an active volcano where the Earth's molten core created conditions that would have been instantly lethal to unprotected mortals, candidates faced the ultimate test of courage and determination, while learning to harness the passionate forces that drove all forms of creative and destructive change. The constant presence of flame and lava served as both challenge and teacher, demonstrating that the same energy that could consume and destroy could also forge and transform, creating beauty and utility from raw materials through the application of intense heat and pressure. The fire sage, who emerged from this crucible of physical and spiritual trial, became the guardian of passionate energy in all its manifestations, responsible for ensuring that the drive toward action and achievement remained balanced with wisdom and compassion. They learned to perceive the inner fires that burned within all conscious beings, understanding when these flames needed to be kindled to inspire courage and determination, when they required fuel to sustain long-term effort, and when they needed to be banked or redirected to prevent destructive excess. The trials within the fire temple tested not just physical endurance but also emotional resilience and spiritual clarity, forcing candidates to confront their deepest fears and most powerful desires while maintaining the inner balance that would allow them to wield elemental fire without being consumed by it. They learned that true strength came not from the absence of passion but from its perfect integration with wisdom, creating individuals who could inspire others to greatness while remaining centered in their own understanding of what constituted worthy goals. The water temple, constructed within a series of interconnected pools and channels where crystal-clear springs emerged from deep underground sources, provided the setting for learning about the flowing, adaptive qualities that allowed consciousness to navigate change while maintaining essential identity. Here, surrounded by the constant sound of moving water that could be soothing or energizing depending on its rhythm and volume, candidates developed the flexibility and persistence that would allow them to serve effectively, regardless of what circumstances they might encounter. The water sage learned to embody the principle of gentle persistence that could overcome any obstacle through patient application of consistent pressure, understanding that the most powerful changes often occurred gradually and quietly rather than through dramatic confrontation or overwhelming force. They developed the ability to perceive the underlying currents that shaped events and relationships, learning to work with these hidden influences rather than against them in order to guide situations toward positive outcomes. The lessons of the water temple emphasize purification and healing, both physical and spiritual, teaching candidates to recognize the various forms of corruption and contamination that could poison individuals, communities, and entire civilizations. The water sage became skilled in techniques for cleansing not just obvious toxins and diseases, but also the subtler forms of spiritual pollution that could gradually erode moral strength and pervert judgment, creating conditions where evil could take root and flourish, even among well-intentioned people. Deep within the earth, in caverns so far below the surface that they existed in perpetual darkness, illuminated only by phosphorescent crystals and the inner light of spiritual practice, the Shadow Temple provided the most challenging and dangerous environment for the development of sage consciousness. Here, candidates confronted not just the absence of physical light, but also the psychological darkness that dwelt within their own hearts. Learning to acknowledge and integrate the destructive impulses and hidden fears that most people prefer to ignore or deny. The Shadow Sage, who emerged from these depths, had achieved a form of wisdom that transcended the normal human tendency to divide experience into categories of good and evil, light and dark, acceptable and forbidden. They understood that true balance required the integration of all aspects of existence, including those that seemed negative or threatening, and that the attempt to eliminate shadow entirely inevitably led to greater imbalance and eventual catastrophe. This did not mean that the Shadow Sage endorsed or encouraged evil, but rather that they possessed the wisdom to understand evil's true nature and origins, allowing them to respond to it more effectively than those who approach darkness with simple opposition or denial. They could perceive the wounded places in individual and collective consciousness where corruption first took root, intervening to heal these spiritual injuries before they could develop into more serious forms of moral disease. The Spirit Temple, constructed at a location where the barriers between different planes of existence were naturally thin, provided the setting for the most profound and dangerous form of consciousness transformation that the sage tradition encompassed. Here, candidates learned to expand their awareness beyond the normal boundaries of individual identity, developing the ability to perceive and interact with forms of consciousness that existed in dimensions parallel to but normally separate from ordinary physical reality. The Spirit Sage, who completed this ultimate initiation, gained access to wisdom that transcended not just personal limitations, but also the usual constraints of linear time and three-dimensional space. They could perceive probability streams and potential futures, understanding how present choices would influence long-term outcomes in ways that allowed them to provide guidance that remained relevant across multiple generations. Yet this expanded awareness came with proportional responsibilities, as the Spirit Sage became accountable for maintaining the integrity of the boundaries between different planes of existence, while also facilitating necessary communication and energy exchange between them. They served as guardians against the kind of dimensional intrusions that could destabilize the entire cosmic order, while also ensuring that beneficial influences from higher realms could reach those who needed guidance and inspiration. The temples themselves became more than just training grounds for individual sages, evolving into permanent fixtures of the spiritual landscape that could provide benefits to the entire kingdom, even when no active sage was present to maintain them. Each temple generated fields of beneficial energy that extended far beyond their physical boundaries, creating zones of enhanced spiritual clarity and protection that could resist the corrupting influences that periodically swept through the world. The architecture of these sacred spaces incorporated principles that modern understanding would struggle to comprehend, using combinations of geometry, crystal resonance, and consciousness-focusing techniques to create environments where divine energy could manifest more readily than in ordinary locations. The temples served as anchor points for cosmic forces that might otherwise have remained too ethereal to provide practical assistance to mortal beings facing concrete challenges. Within each temple, chambers were dedicated to specific forms of spiritual practice and magical working, providing spaces where individuals could come to seek healing, guidance, or protection when their normal resources proved insufficient to address whatever difficulties they faced. The temples welcomed visitors from all walks of life and all racial backgrounds, recognizing that wisdom and spiritual need were not limited by social status, educational background, or cultural identity. The network of temples created a web of spiritual support that spanned the entire kingdom, allowing beneficial influences to flow between different regions, and ensuring that no community would be left entirely without access to divine guidance during times of crisis. Messages and energy could be transmitted instantly between temples through means that transcended normal physical communication, creating a information and support system that could coordinate responses to threats or disasters with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The sages who served as guardians of these sacred spaces developed their own forms of communication and cooperation that allowed them to function as a unified force, despite their individual specializations and the vast distances that often separated their physical locations. Their consciousness could merge temporarily during moments of great need, combining their different perspectives and abilities to address challenges that would have overwhelmed any single individual, regardless of their wisdom or power. This collaborative approach to spiritual guardianship reflected the deeper understanding that had motivated the creation of the sage tradition in the first place. The recognition that the challenges facing conscious beings were too complex and multifaceted to be addressed through any single approach or perspective. Each sage brought unique insights and capabilities that complemented and enhanced those of their colleagues, creating a collective wisdom that exceeded the sum of its individual components. The trials and challenges faced by each generation of sages varied according to the specific threats and opportunities that characterized their historical period, but certain fundamental responsibilities remained constant across all eras. They served as early warning systems for spiritual dangers that might not become apparent to ordinary consciousness until they had already caused significant damage, using their enhanced perception to detect the subtle signs of approaching corruption or imbalance. When necessary, the sages could intervene directly in situations that threatened the well-being of individuals or communities, though they preferred to work through inspiration and guidance rather than overt displays of power. Their goal was always to help others develop their own wisdom and capabilities rather than creating dependence on external authority, understanding that true strength came from inner development rather than reliance on outside protection. The process of selecting and training new sages was carefully managed to ensure continuity of wisdom and responsibility across generational transitions, with experienced sages identifying and mentoring potential successors long before their own time of active service came to an end. This created a form of institutional memory that could preserve important knowledge and techniques across centuries or millennia, ensuring that hard-won understanding would not be lost due to the inevitable changes that affected all mortal institutions. The sages also served as historians and archivists, maintaining records not just of external events, but also of the spiritual and psychological patterns that influence the development of individuals and civilizations over extended periods. These archives provided resources for understanding cyclical phenomena and predicting how similar circumstances might unfold in future situations, allowing for more effective responses to recurrent challenges. Yet perhaps their most important function was serving as living examples of what mortal consciousness could achieve when it was dedicated to service rather than self-aggrandizement, wisdom rather than mere cleverness, and love rather than fear or hatred. The very existence of the sages provided hope and inspiration to countless individuals who might otherwise have despaired of ever transcending their limitations or making meaningful contributions to the well-being of others. Their legacy extended far beyond their specific actions or teachings, encompassing the fundamental transformation in human understanding that their example made possible. They demonstrated that mortal beings could indeed achieve forms of consciousness that approached divine awareness, that individual sacrifice could serve collective benefit, and that wisdom and compassion were not merely idealistic aspirations, but practical tools for addressing the deepest challenges that faced conscious beings. The temples they established and the traditions they created would endure through all the ages that followed, providing resources and inspiration for heroes and ordinary citizens alike. When darkness threatened to overwhelm the light and despair challenged the foundations of hope, their eternal vigil continued even when their individual forms passed beyond mortal perception, their consciousness having become so integrated with cosmic forces that they remained active participants in the ongoing struggle between creation and destruction that defined the fundamental nature of existence itself. And so the ancient myths of Hyrule weave together like golden threads in an eternal tapestry, each story connecting to all others in patterns that span the ages. From the first breath of creation by the golden goddesses to the endless cycle of heroism and renewal, these tales remind us that some truths transcend time itself. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you'll walk among these ancient peoples, witness the glory of forgotten civilizations, and understand the deep wisdom that flows through every stone and stream of this timeless realm. The myths sleep now in the collective memory of the world, but they dream of awakening in hearts ready to hear their whispered truths. Rest well, knowing that somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, these eternal stories continue their gentle dance through the corridors of time, carrying with them the promise that wonder and magic never truly fade. They simply wait for the right moment to bloom again, in souls prepared to believe in the impossible made manifest through love and courage. The Kokiri children still play in forest glades that exist beyond the reach of ordinary perception, their laughter echoing through dimensions where joy has no ending. The Zora sages continue their patient contemplation in crystal chambers where wisdom flows like water through countless generations of accumulated understanding. The Goron Brotherhood maintains their eternal fellowship in mountain halls where strength is measured not by power but by the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. High above, the Ritos soar through currents of air and time, their songs carrying messages of hope across distances that span both space and spirit. In desert places where stars shine with ancient light, the Gerudo warriors dance their lightning dances, their movements tracing patterns that connect earth to sky in celebrations of fierce beauty and unbreakable loyalty. The Sheikah watch from shadows that conceal not darkness but deeper forms of illumination, their vigil ensuring that knowledge and wisdom will endure through whatever trials may come. The Zonai spiral through realms beyond naming, their consciousness expanded beyond individual identity to embrace forms of love so vast that they can only be expressed through complete self-sacrifice. In the Twilight Realm, those who once sought power through corruption continue their slow journey toward understanding, learning that redemption is always possible for those willing to embrace humility over pride, service over domination, love over fear. The dragons that were once mortal kings continue their eternal flight through dimensions where duty and compassion have transformed individual identity into something that serves the good of all. The windfish dreams new dreams now, its consciousness enriched by the experience of seeing reality through countless different perspectives, its song carrying harmonies that speak of the beauty that can emerge when separation dissolves into unity. The ancient sages maintain their eternal vigil from temples that exist as much in spirit as in stone, their wisdom available to any who seek guidance with pure hearts and genuine desire to serve something greater than themselves. In the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the gentle moment when consciousness releases its grip on the waking world and allows itself to drift into the realm of dreams and possibilities, these ancient stories continue to unfold. They speak of a time when gods walked among mortals, when heroes rose to face impossible challenges, when love proved stronger than any darkness the universe could conjure. But more than this, they whisper of truths that remain as vital today as they were in the beginning of all things, that courage is not the absence of fear, but action taken in spite of it. That wisdom comes not from accumulating knowledge, but from learning to see with the heart. That true power is found not in the ability to control others, but in the willingness to sacrifice oneself for their well-being. These myths are not merely stories of the past, but prophecies of what consciousness can achieve when it chooses light over shadow, creation over destruction, hope over despair. They remind us that within every heart burns a spark of the divine flame that first brought order to chaos. That every soul carries the potential to become a hero in their own right. That every act of love and compassion adds another thread to the tapestry of light that holds the darkness at bay. As sleep carries you into realms where time flows in spirals rather than straight lines, where past and future meet in an eternal present moment of infinite possibility, carry with you the knowledge that these ancient myths are not separate from your own story, but part of it. You too are connected to the great chain of being that stretches from the first moment of creation to the last star that will burn in an impossibly distant future. In your dreams, you may find yourself walking through the lost woods where the Koroks still tend their secret gardens of wonder, or soaring with the Rito above clouds that hold the memory of every prayer ever whispered to the winds. You might discover yourself learning the ancient dances of the Gerudo beneath stars that have watched over the desert since the world was young, or sitting in contemplation with Zora elders who remember when the first songs were sung to call forth life from lifeless water. These are not mere fantasies, but glimpses of deeper truths, moments when the barriers between different forms of consciousness become thin enough to allow recognition of the fundamental unity that connects all existence in patterns of meaning and beauty that transcend ordinary understanding. In the realm of dreams, all myths are true, all stories live and breathe, all possibilities remain forever open to those with eyes to see and hearts to understand. The ancient myths of Hyrule continue their eternal dance through the corridors of time, carrying within them seeds of hope that can bloom in even the darkest soil, flames of courage that can kindle light in even the deepest shadow, springs of wisdom that can flow through even the most arid wasteland of despair. They wait patiently for new heroes to arise, new stories to unfold, new chapters to be written in the great book of existence. Rest now in the gentle embrace of these timeless tales, knowing that their truth does not depend on your belief, but offers itself freely to any who are willing to receive it. Let their ancient wisdom wash over you like morning light, dispelling the shadows of night. Like healing water flowing over wounds that have festered too long in darkness. Like the first breath of spring awakening life that seemed lost forever beneath winter's frozen ground. The spiral dance continues, the eternal cycle turns. And in the space between sleeping and waking, between one story and the next, between the last word spoken and the first word yet to come, the ancient myths of Hyrule keep their patient vigil. They are the keepers of dreams and the guardians of hope, the living memory of what was and the eternal promise of what yet may be. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you to realms where wonder never ends and love never fails, where heroes still rise to face impossible odds, and where the light of ancient wisdom continues to shine like a beacon guiding souls home through the vast darkness that separates one story from another, one heart from its destined joy, one dream from its perfect fulfillment in the waking world of infinite possibility.